This time, think I've hit my limit. Think I've hit my limit this time. I've been trying to take it easy, but still take it. Make it better if I break it. Sometimes that gets hard. If I slip to older ways, the poorer plans of darker days, I need a shoulder or a friend. I hope I see you then. Tell me why you won't go. I've tried to let it show. I've been to the bottom and back so many times that I simply lost track. And I think I've hit my limit. This time. Well, I think I hit my limit this time.
Well, on this Monday morning, we wish you a good morning, and thanks for joining us here on Real Talk. Ryan Jesperson with you on this February 22nd. Technical producer Samuel G. Brooks along for the ride. How you doing, pal?
Morning, everyone. I'm great. I'm very relaxed this morning.
You're feeling relaxed this morning.
Yeah.
To what do you attribute this relaxed feeling?
I probably just
well prepared.
Well prepared, and I spent a bunch of time at the dog park yesterday. So just
attaboy.
like having a good day.
Attaboy.
Yeah.
We have a coming up in Positive Reflections presented by our friends at Kubi Energy. I'm thinking that's going to be a couple of hours from now, but 90 minutes to a couple of hours from now. There's a story of a dog rescue.
Yes,
and it's not like the rescue that you and your wonderful partner undertook through the course of the pandemic.
we're talking a legit rescue.
Yeah, it's not giving a dog a home. It's actually physically, literally rescuing a dog in peril. And here's the thing. It's previous Real Talk guests that did the rescuing, which is really exciting. A mix of humans and animals. Someone's going to write in and quite rightfully say, Ryan, humans actually are animals. And that reiterates the fact that we want to hear from you this morning. We know it's going to be a busy morning on the show. I'm pretty sure that some of you are aware that we do have an exclusive one-on-one interview coming up in about a half hour from now. A former colleague of mine, a former radio host. She's a freelance newspaper columnist. She's the former leader of Alberta's official opposition, the Wild Rose Party. A polarizing figure, to be sure. Danielle Smith will be joining us just after 9 o'clock, coming up here on the show. She signed off from her talk show on Chorus Radio on Friday. She left on her own accord, sorta. And, I mean, by definition, she did. But we'll get into the story, what prompted her to leave a high-profile radio gig. And then I've got a whole bunch of questions to ask Danielle about a whole bunch of things that went on. We're going to talk about, her assertion that just the other day in the Edmonton Journal that wind and solar has had its chance to prove itself and it failed. I know many of you have written into us, have hit up our hashtag RealTalkRJ over the weekend to let us know the type of questions you'd like to hear. You want to hear Danielle Smith account for talking about hydroxychloroquine back in the day, earlier in the pandemic. I'm sure that will come up as part of the conversation. We're going to get into some of her comments on freedom and lockdown measures. She's hosting an event later tonight with Lieutenant Colonel retired David Redmond, who was on this show a couple of weeks ago, you remember. So we'll get into some of these measures. Of course, we've since followed up on our conversation with both MLA Drew Barnes and the retired lieutenant colonel with a panel of physicians who we had them vet those interviews and go through and say, hey, listen, point by point, this is kind of how we feel about what we're hearing here or what we're reading here. the idea of this is to further conversation, to have meaningful conversation, to talk with people that we don't necessarily always agree with. You remember what Irshad Manji talked to us about last week, about moral courage in messy times, and the challenge that she issued to us to push ourselves outside of our own comfort zones and try to meet people where they're at and have these types of conversations. We're looking forward to that. Emily Lakdawalla has agreed to join us. I'm very excited about this. She's a planetary geologist, which means that right out of the gates, she's smarter than 99% of us.
Correct.
And I would love to meet the 1% of our audience that would be smarter than Emily Lakdawalla, because we could learn a lot from them too.
I mean, you know what they say about if you're the smartest guy in the room, you're in the wrong room.
You're in the wrong room.
Exactly.
That's right. You hear from leaders. I remember former U.S. President George W. Bush, and people took little pot shots at him for this statement, but I appreciate it. He said he wanted to make sure that the room was full of people smarter than him. And people would always say, well, yeah, W, I mean, you know. But seriously, folks, it's a great recipe for success to learn from others. Emily is a solar system specialist, a science communicator, and now that we've had an opportunity to check out what Mars Perseverance rover is sending back to NASA, sending back to the world, I mean, everybody seems to be paying attention. New photos, new ideas. They're getting set to launch that little chopper. What is Emily excited to find out about? What has she learned to this point thus far? What have we as human beings learned from Perseverance's first few days on the red planet? And what does she hope to learn in weeks, months, and years to come? Emily's going to join us right around 10 o'clock today. We're also going to touch on some of the stories making news over the weekend. High-profile stories right out of the province of Alberta, including Grace Life Church just west of Edmonton holding another packed service yesterday in defiance of public health order. You know for a fact that their pastor sits in the Edmonton Remand Center as we speak, the associate pastor delivering the message. We're going to bring you some of that message so you can get a sense of what that congregation is hearing from its leadership right now. I think that's important to get into. Plus these end the lockdown rallies, some angst heaped upon a bunch of people, including journalists, shooters like camera operators and the like down at the Alberta Legislature grounds yesterday. We're going to take you there and give you both my thoughts on that plus yours. Many of you have already taken the opportunity to check in right now at talk@ryanjesperson.com. You're already chiming in, letting us know how you feel about all that. So we've got a lot of ground to cover today, to say the least. We want to remind you that each and every morning, Bitcoin Well is proud to present Real Talk as our presenting sponsor. 2021, to say the very least, has been a huge year for cryptocurrency, in particular Bitcoin. Just a couple of days ago, a lot of people were keeping a keen eye on where that crypto was going as Bitcoin popped above 70 grand Canadian. Sort of blown a lot of people's minds. If you're looking for insight into what this means, whether this is a good time to maybe take 1% of your savings like Bitcoin Well talks about or invest it or maybe just learn a little bit more about it. If you want to do it in a pressure-free environment, one you can trust, check out Bitcoin Well under the sponsors tab at ryanjesperson.com.
Real Talk starts right now. Here's Ryan Jesperson.
As mentioned, the congregation at Grace Life Church in Parkland County, west of Edmonton, gathering again yesterday on Sunday. And here's the thing, not at the 15% capacity that would fall in line with the pandemic health orders issued by Alberta's Chief Medical Officer of Health and enforced, perhaps I'll put that in quotes, but enforced by law enforcement, RCMP, Edmonton Police, Calgary Police Service, wherever you are, it depends. But this church gathered to capacity yesterday. As a matter of fact, they started sending people to their overflow and then ultimately inviting them to join the live streaming service from the parking lot when the church hit its fire code capacity. So this was a packed house, people sitting side by side by side. We've seen video inside the church, nobody wearing masks. I wanted to give you a sense of what the message is from the pulpit, why this church continues to defy public health orders, despite the fact that its pastor, James Coates, is currently sitting in the Edmonton Remand Center. If you're wondering why he's still jailed, it's because he refuses to comply. He will not tell police. He will refuse to comply, telling the courts he will not comply with the conditions of his release, which among them, of course, do not bring hundreds of people together in defiance of public health orders. He says, I can't do that. I won't do that. So they're not letting him out of jail. Jacob Spence is the pastor there, associate pastor, who took to the pulpit yesterday, and we want to bring you some of what he had to say so you can get an idea of what the messaging's like. Here it is, Grace Life Church yesterday.
And so my purpose this morning is to shift the focus from government to the church, to the local churches, to the church that has been purchased by the blood of Christ, Acts 20:28. And there's a truth that there are fundamental attitudes and behaviors characteristic to the Christian and certainly evident in the Christian church. Certainly, these fundamental attitudes and behaviors must be present then among local churches. And I would say that if a church is not adorned with the gospel, then she is an unfaithful church, and she is in need of repentance. And now, I know it's certainly true in our generation. We've entered into a most difficult time. For those of us here, I don't think that we know of a time when the church has faced a greater or more divisive issue than the one that we've seen in her proper response, what her proper response should be to government encroachment. And our beloved pastor has clearly exegeted Romans 13 to help us understand this government overreach. And those sermons and our position are posted on our website, and you can certainly feel free to visit there. The Word of God has been clearly explained. Our theological positions are clear, as is our desire to be citizens here in Alberta, certainly, and be responsible with that. And we feel a responsible response is to love our neighbors by making sure that the gospel goes forward, to make sure that those who are the ambassadors of Jesus Christ are constantly being fed so that they can go out continually, week by week, into the world and testify to Christ.
See, this is some fascinating insight to me when this individual, this pastor, Jacob Spence, indicates that their perception of loving your neighbor is not adhering to public health guidelines, is not keeping distance between you, is not wearing masks, is not gathering in worship through a live streaming service like many, like thousands of faith communities are doing across the board, hundreds of thousands of communities across Canada. But instead, loving your neighbor is continuing to gather and defying these orders in order to equip people to witness, to share the gospel. Now, it ramps up from there. He's already started throwing hand grenades at other churches, calling other congregations unfaithful, which is a big swipe. And then it ramps up even further.
I've been reminded of Jesus' trial, and even the trials of the apostles, as false charges were placed as evidence against them. And certainly we've seen that take place as well. Hearing that our pastor just simply doing what he has done faithfully for the last decade of his ministry, and now to be deemed as a danger to the public and to this province, to be seen as a threat for doing nothing different than he's done for 10 years plus. It baffles the mind. We've seen our premier and a bureaucrat behave like Pilate and wash their hands of the injustice. But most troubling for me has been the response of professing Christians who have handed over the headship of the church to the province's premiers and unelected chief medical officers. I've heard church leaders in this province ask our premier and the chief medical officer, "Will you allow us to sing?" Would you be willing to give us 30%? Will you allow us to teach our children in Sunday school? It's shocking to hear church leaders first praise these people for what they're doing, and then to ask allowances of them. And perhaps it's more shocking to see that they have the audacity to answer those questions, that they think that they can give those allowances.
Thinks he's above the law, right? Thinks that the entire congregation, as a matter of fact, thinks that Bible believers are above the law. That's really the only way to put it. You know, that lawmaking, he's talking about Alberta's government. He's talking about Chief Medical Officer of Health and further in the sermon. And we've been wanting to give you meaningful bits of this. I mean, it's easy to pick and choose and go in there and take 8-second tidbits, 10-second tidbits to suit an editorial narrative. I'm giving you 2 minutes at a time. If Buddy is misrepresenting his position through 4 total minutes of preaching, that's his problem, not Real Talk's. He believes that they are above the law. Talking about the audacity of lawmakers. That's kind of how a civilized society works. Where do you draw the line? Where do you draw? He's appalled at other church leaders that are asking, that are working with, negotiating with public health officials and government officials to try to get, like he said, 30% of their congregation back. Right now, it's limited, by the way, to 15% of fire code. This church is packed to the rafters. Mocking these other faith leaders for working with public health officials to try to find some way to get their congregation back together in person, while at the same time providing live streaming services, making sacrifices like everybody else in every other industry. I mean, the thing that blows my mind, if you're a Christian restaurant owner and you've had your door shut, I mean, this would be infuriating me if I was a person of faith that owned a restaurant or that owned a retail store that was so eager to see vaccinations get out and society somewhat return to normal. And this is happening here in the name of the Lord. I mean, don't even get me started about him comparing his pastor sitting in the Edmonton remand to the trials of Jesus and the apostles. And what about this? I mean, if anybody sitting in this congregation is believing, is lapping up what this guy is serving, you know, this pastor has been, to quote this individual, he's been doing faithfully the same thing that he's been doing for the last decade. And all of a sudden now, says this pastor, he's a threat for doing nothing different, for doing the exact same thing he's been doing for 10 years. And all of a sudden now he's a threat. It baffles the mind. We're in a pandemic. What do you mean the same thing he's been doing for 10 years? Completely irrelevant. Totally irrelevant. This guy, what? You get engaged, you run off, you get married, you have a beautiful ceremony. Your wife hears you leave in the night. She follows you as you make your way down the beach, down the pathway. Sees you buying shots for the shooter girls and dirty dancing with all the single ladies, and your new wife says, "What the hell are you doing?" And you said, "I'm just doing what I've been doing for the last decade." All of a sudden, now it's a threat. Things change, pal. For the last decade, when people have been able to gather in churches and in hockey arenas and in restaurants and in shopping malls and on soccer fields and around campfire circles and everywhere else, it's been fine. But now we're asking you guys, like everybody else, to get on board and try to see if we can beat this thing. I mean, you talk about what baffles the mind. It's this attitude. So we're getting emails from viewers like Randy, who hits us up at talk@ryanjustman.com. He says, I'm in support of this pastor being arrested. He says, as a matter of fact, I think all the people going to this church should be fined. we're hearing different. Some of you were saying, well, what can RCMP do here? What's the deal? I've heard some people saying they're probably, when it comes to law enforcement, what they're probably trying to do is keep the temperature as cool as possible, but they're probably recording license plate numbers. There is an investigation underway. The church has confirmed that they continue to receive paperwork from Alberta Health Services following every service. The pastor acknowledges it's because he knows that AHS is building a case against them. They're building this martyr complex, building it as strongly as they can. And you think of the money they're going to make from this? You think of this pastor sitting in jail right now? This guy's crazy like a fox. You watch, mark my words. It might not be on one of the regular channels, but they'll make a movie about him for sure. He'll get a book deal for sure. He was the pastor that was jailed. Randy says, as a matter of fact, even better than finding everybody at the church, I would say block the entrance or maybe block the exit after people try to leave. Quarantine them all for 14 days. Randy says, for context, I have a friend who just lost his brother a month ago, 46 years old, to COVID. He was healthy before. One of my neighbors is a nurse that hardly sees her family, comes home crying several times a week from the death she sees at her work. Her words. Randy says, and I'm a churchgoer. And I really miss going to church in person, but our family is making the best of worship online. And to these naysayers, he says, grow up. He says, some of you need to spend a day in the ICU. See what these healthcare workers are living through, trying to keep people alive on a daily basis. Randy says, I hope to hear this read, Ryan. I'll be catching up on the show this afternoon. Well, Randy, thanks for that. This isn't the only thing over the weekend that's I think, portraying Alberta in an unflattering light, to put it lightly. Some pretty troubling stuff happening with regards to demonstrations, the end the lockdown mask pushback, if you want to call it. Drew Barnes has been fanning the flames in southern Alberta. We talked to him just a couple of weeks ago to get his take on what's going on with this end the lockdown caucus. I'm obviously going to ask Danielle Smith about that. Let's take a look, Sam, at what went down. This is footage captured by, as a matter of fact, he's a friend of mine. Rod Maldaner. He's a longtime video journalist. He's a camera operator in Edmonton, and he's shooting for Bailey Nitty, who's a city. There's Rod right there. You can see him in the frame. So this is Bailey that's actually shooting this first-hand video. Listen to this.
You caused this problem because you're misreporting the truth. That's what's going on, and you know that. 6 feet. You won't move back.
Fake news.
Fake news. Get out of here. You guys are disgusting. You guys are disgusting. You're not news. You're propaganda. Get out of here. You're liars. You're liars. You're lying to the people. You're liars to the people. You know it. If you don't know it, you're not doing your research. Yeah, put the camera on me. Great. What are you going to edit? You're liars.
Your fridge is full.
You're liars.
You're going to be held accountable for your lies.
You're going to be sued.
Yeah. You're going to be held accountable for all your lies.
Complicit with communism, you prostitutes.
I can't just like laugh.
So this gives you an idea of what journalists encountered yesterday covering this end the lockdown rally. Number one, I mean, we can get into some of the signs and the stuff about globalists and all that, and you're going to see some familiar faces here. Those Pavlovsky brothers, those are the guys that have organized the March for Jesus rally down in Calgary that's been widely criticized for its inherent homophobia. If you want to read more about that, just Google Rick McIver March for Jesus. That was one that one of Alberta's senior cabinet ministers had to kind of walk himself back from a few years ago. This Artur Pavlovsky guy, he's that same guy. He's the guy that was organizing. He and his brother, they organized the end the lockdown rally at Chinook Center last weekend. Remember we showed you that video, and here they are now in Edmonton. So we can get into the content on the signs and what the people are saying and what they're arguing about, or we can just get to like the basic one of the things. I'm not even trying to be funny. I'm not even trying to be cheeky, but if you're throwing a rally, if you're gathering people's attention, if you're trying to grab the attention of everybody and bring drums and signs, and then threaten the journalists that show up, do you even understand what you're doing? I saw this interesting tweet, this from Jason Van Rassel, who a longtime print reporter in the province, and Jason tweeted out what troubled him most about this. He said, I was a reporter for 20 plus years, mainly covering crime. He said, I wrote about gang wars in Calgary, outlaw motorcycle gangs. I visited prisons. I interviewed killers. I went to hundreds of crime scenes. I was never treated like this while on the job, not even by hardened criminals. And look at the response from Carolyn Dunn, a longtime reporter for CBC The National. Carolyn says, me too, except, it's now routine in person, by email, on Twitter. It's exhausting. It's tough to see this stuff going on at the Alberta legislature. It's tough to see journalists being treated this way. It's tough to see people gathering en masse. I know for a lot of folks, you're going to be sitting here going, you know what I'd love to do? I would love myself to gather with all my friends and get together and hang out in close, tight circles and laugh and sing. But we're not doing it. Because we understand that, right now, we're not even talking. I saw an interview with Anthony Fauci the other night. Down in the United States, you're going to say apples and oranges, maybe. The Americans, more than 60 million people have already received their first dose of the vaccine. So in my estimation, the Americans are doing better than we are right now, but I digress. Anthony Fauci was asked by, I think it was Leslie Stahl, one of the journalists asked, the top voice when it comes to government policy and the intersection of government policy and medicine, science in the United States right now. Anthony Fauci, obviously a household name, was asked, do you think we'll be wearing masks in 2022? He says it's possible. We're still in February of 2021. How many of you, like me, were optimistic that we were going to get some sort of magic bullet? We were going to be able to just hit a reset button, that 2021 was going to allow us to flush 2020. Now, unrealistic, obviously. But these are the types of things. These are the setbacks. And the lockdown, well, no shit. Quit gathering together in the hundreds, breathing and coughing all over each other. But are we going to get through? Is this message going to get through? Or is there such a cynicism around government, around the science, that it's just not possible? This is a theme that's woven itself through so many of our shows. We know that. It's something I'm sure we'll take on with Danielle Smith coming up in just about 10 minutes' time. Lorraine says, I'd love to have a big freaking protest arguing against coal mining with thousands of people. Lorraine says, you know what would happen? Of course, we'd all get arrested. Sarah says, I think that this past weekend's protests are maybe larger than normal. Calgary protesters are convoying up to Edmonton and joining together. Rod, Rod Maldaner's watching right now. Kudos to him. Rod's the camera operator. He's a personal friend of mine. Rod and I worked together for many years. He says, just a note on that video, the man that told us we would be held accountable was the guy that was arrested on Saturday. He says, make of that what you will. That from Rod Maldaner. I love Rod. The one thing I love in that video, when the guy comes up to him and he's like, fake news, whatever he says, and Rod just goes, 6 feet. Rod's
and then the guy says to him, well, then you can move back.
Yeah, you can move. But again, I'm not, and there's nothing funny about this except for sometimes when you just look at sometimes people, it is, you have to laugh. We're throwing a big rally. We're advertising it everywhere we can advertise it. Social media, they're posting, I'm sure it's on Parler and all the other places that we don't dare tread. But I wouldn't be surprised, if they were, the whole idea of the rally is to get the word out. The whole idea of making signs is for people to see them, right? Unless you're under the impression that on a Sunday afternoon, everybody making the rules and making the laws is sitting at the windows of the Alberta legislature watching you and reading your signs, because they're not. So to hold a rally, to advertise it, and then to threaten journalists that show up to cover the rally, to me is just you're going to say, why are you honing in on that point? It just demonstrates the lack of basic understanding, the lack of basic awareness, the zero common sense. We're going to get to some of your emails. You can find it at talk@ryanjesperson.com is the best way to get us. Real Talk RJ is our hashtag. Every week we bring you our Y Station question of the week. And this past week, we asked you how you were feeling as COVID-19 restrictions are being eased. We asked you how comfortable you would feel, assuming that all reasonable social distancing measures and mask wearing is in place. How comfortable are you with? And then we gave you a bunch of options. Can you pull up those graphics from Y Station? Our partners at Y Station, they're the official research and strategy partners here at Real Talk, do a great job with this question of the week. You can find it at ryanjesperson.com right across the top bar. We've already got our next one up. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But here are some interesting notes of what more than 1,000 of you told us last week. I think it was 1,016 of you that told us this. 88% of respondents. So approximately 880 of you, because we had just right about 1,000. 88% of you would stay away from church services with occupancy over 15%. 88%. That's pretty huge. Let's take a look at another one, Sam. These are some things we're able to pull from that data, make quick observations. 30% of you, 30% of those that responded to our question of the week would be comfortable with a small indoor gathering. 30%, 1 in 3. And here's an interesting one when it comes to organized sport. Okay, we'll get that. Under current public health measures, you, Real Talkers, feel most comfortable. Number 1, 2 out of 3 of you, about 67% of you, feel comfortable at outdoor gatherings of less than 10 people. You also feel relatively safe at the grocery store. 65% say under current public health measures, you feel most comfortable. 65% at the grocery store. Now take a look at this. This is interesting too. 1 in 5 of you, so it's still a pretty modest number. 22. I know there's a lot of numbers here. We try to make it simple, and if you're like me, my head starts, my thoughts start swimming around. I lose the track. But 22% of you are comfortable with letting kids play organized sports, like 1 in 5. But only 16 of you are comfortable with adults playing organized sports. So you're slightly more comfortable with kids playing as opposed to adults playing. I wondered if it might be the other way around. Now, we can get into more of this. Like you've left great comments for us as well, which is what we love. This is also a chance for me to remind you that if you support us on Patreon every month, you can go to RyanJesperson.com. Right in the top right-hand corner, you can learn more about supporting us on Patreon. Our Patreon subscribers every Sunday night get exclusive access to what's called the Top Line Report. It's typically, what is it, Sam? It's about 12 pages, something like that?
Yeah. It's just it's a really good data summary in a nice, easy 12-page package.
Yeah, I mean, put
It's
together
great.
professionally. This is a scientific survey ish. I mean, we'll get, once you start saying things like scientific surveys, you got to qualify them. That's for the pollsters to explain. It's not my science. That's why we partner with Y Station as opposed to trying to do this ourselves. But it's an amazing insight into how your fellow Canadians are feeling about things. And strong representation from the prairie provinces. So it's a great way to pick people's brains there. A few insightful comments. I'll read one at random. Listener says, I feel safer in a restaurant now than I did before COVID, to be honest. Way cleaner. Plexiglass, space between diners, masks, no more shared ketchups and salt and peppers, and menus are actually cleaned, or they're just using a QR code you can read on your phone. So I feel safer now than I did before. Interesting point. Another says, I trust almost nobody else to be as safe as me and my partner. Another says, I'm a healthcare worker who's received both doses of the vaccine. I'm still hesitant about doing things out and about where restrictions are lifted, like restaurants, for fear that I may be a carrier and I could potentially harm staff. An interesting perspective there as well. Danielle Smith coming up in just a minute. Wanted to remind you that conversations like this happen because we have a team of partners that step up and support us in amazing ways. And that includes the team at St. Albert and Sherwood Dodge. 2021 is a big year for the Jeep lineup, including the reintroduction of that Jeep Grand Wagoneer. They are reinventing the luxury SUV and expectations there. The Grand Wagoneer available later this year. Right now, that 7-passenger Grand Cherokee is what everybody's talking about. You haven't been able to get it like that before, and if you're looking for bang for buck in the SUV market, take a look at the Jeep Grand Cherokee. You won't find any better selection than you will at St. Albert and Sherwood Dodge. Also wanted to remind you that we are inching toward opening day for Friesen Brothers' 15th Alberta location, just off the Anthony Henday at Rabbit Hill Road in Edmonton. It's their first time into the Metro Edmonton region. Friesen Brothers for more than 60 years has been supporting Alberta producers. It's why you'll only find Alberta beef, pork, chicken, turkey, Alberta produce when they can, even Alberta milled flour in their famous sourdough bread. Friesen Brothers opening March 5th in South Edmonton. Sam, let's take a quick look at what's making news on this Monday morning. The Prime Minister telling the the provinces to brace themselves for an influx of vaccines. Canada poised to receive a record number of COVID-19 vaccines this week, thanks to scheduled deliveries from both Pfizer, BioNTech, and Moderna. The Public Health Agency of Canada says it expects more than 640,000 shots from the pharmaceutical companies this week. That would be the largest number of deliveries in a single week. Meantime, a study of the COVID-19 vaccination program in Scotland has found that both that Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine we talked about, plus the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccines, reduced hospitalization by up to 94% after a single dose. This study was released this morning by scientists at the University of Edinburgh and the University of Strathclyde. They're taking a look at hospitalization rates among more than 1 million Scots who received one shot of either vaccine back in December all the way through to February. And the signs are good, says Aziz Sheikh, a professor of primary care research at the University of Edinburgh. We're overall very impressed. Both vaccines are performing incredibly well. That's an encouraging bit of news on that front. And we're keeping an eye on a story out of northern Saskatchewan as a First Nation there has blockaded a road and issued a cease and desist order against a uranium company based out of Toronto. The Birch Narrows Dene Nation says they took action after workers with Baseload Energy Corp started surveying the band's traditional territory without consent. Chief Jonathan Sylvester, representing the Birch Narrows Dene Nation, says it's very disrespectful, totally uncalled for. This is not being done properly. We'll keep an eye on that story as it continues to develop. Are we ready to rock and roll, Sam?
We're getting there.
Okay.
Just getting Danielle's camera set up.
No problem. Danielle Smith will be joining us in just a moment. I got a ton of emails I can make my way through as well, including a great one from Alicia. This was following our roundtable, our traditional Friday Real Talk roundtable, Fridays at 9 a.m. Mountain, 11 Eastern. We bring you a panel discussion on issues of relevance, issues of interest, issues of concern. And we talked about Black History Month with three remarkable individuals, Andrew Parker, Semhar Tekest, and Eric Domont on Friday. Alicia reached out to us and said, I've been listening to your show since the first day, and I'm really happy to have independent, thoughtful voices in our media landscape. What's most impressed me about your show is the willingness to provide a platform to diverse voices, not just diversity in race or politics, but in topics and experiences and abilities. Alicia says, I often find myself challenged while I tune in, and I think that that's healthy, given the echo chambers that we frequently exist in these days. What compelled me, Ryan, to write today is the panel that you had on for Black History Month. She sent us this just yesterday afternoon. The panel that you had on Black History Month on Friday, my husband and I checked out that segment with our three boys this weekend. Alicia, that's music to my ears. To say that hearing from Ms. Tekest and Mr. Domont and Mr. Parker was incredible would be an understatement. Their insights, their reflections on their experiences resonated deeply with me. I was born and raised in small-town Alberta as the proud daughter of Black immigrants from Barbados. My husband is white, and together we have three amazing biracial boys. We've called Edmonton home for about 20 years. Our boys are all school-aged, and we're happy to see the progress made in the breadth of their educational experience since we were kids. But we've been terrified, though, to be quite honest, that this could all change based on a narrow-minded ideology from whoever runs the province. Alicia says, I share the frustration and anger that's come out across our city regarding recent actions of Edmonton police members evicting fellow citizens from an LRT station into the streets in dangerous weather. I'm in awe at the inaction of enforcement when a church is allowed to repeatedly fly in the face of health orders, and I am gutted to see people peddling propaganda while carrying torches in our streets. I had hoped to never see images from the textbooks of my youth come to life in real time, but here we are. What a powerful statement. Alicia says, in my experience, communication is critical. Words matter, but silence matters too. The silence from many of our leaders this weekend, and frankly, through some of the worst moments our province has faced recently, speaks volumes, and it does not go unnoticed. My husband and I talk to our boys about issues of diversity and equity and inclusion whenever we can, not just when big stuff happens. As Semhar Tekest, that conservative strategist, so aptly stated on Friday, these conversations cannot be like the summer hit song where we then move on to something else. These conversations need to be had with our friends and our families and our colleagues and our neighbors, and they need to be had with and among those who have positions of power, people with public platforms and people without. We need to keep talking and keep those conversations real. We need to speak out. We need to learn our history, even if it's uncomfortable or inconvenient. We need to see compassion, understanding, equal distribution of justice from elected officials and leaders. And perhaps most of all, we need to listen and pay attention to those affected when hatred and contempt emerge in our communities. Alicia says, thanks for Real Talk doing its part to keep conversations going, bringing them to light. My most sincere hope is that others have the courage and integrity to do the same. That from Alicia out of Edmonton. We really appreciate that email. Thanks very much. We're ready to go? All right, for many years, my next guest and I danced, so to speak, the art of the interview when I was working as a talk host on TV, and she was the leader of Alberta's official opposition, the Wild Rose Party. A series of events led to her entry into the broadcast space, where Danielle Smith and I both hosted flagship talk shows for Chorus Radio in the 9 to noon slot-ish. You were 9:30 to 12:30, but right around that same block. We covered elections together. We sat on the provincial election desk. We flew to Toronto. We covered the federal election together in October. And now both of us are gone from there. You leaving on your own accord on Friday, hosting your final show. Thanks for making this your first interview after the fact, and welcome to Real Talk, Danielle.
Oh, my pleasure. You know, every time I've been interviewed by you, because we go back to my political days, it's always sort of a measure of excitement and fear, because you always keep it nice and light and fun, and then whammo, you come in with some hard questions that always hit me in the gut. So I'm prepared for you today.
Well,
I know that your Twitter followers have been actually. I remember we texted on the weekend. I said, judging by the reaction of your Twitter followers, I wonder if I should even be on your show. I don't think there's a lot of excitement for me being here today.
Well, it depends on how you define excitement. They're definitely excited. You know what I was curious to see, and I couldn't do it because you shut down you left Twitter, and I want to ask you why you did that, and I guess this will be that question, but I was actually going to participate in an exercise and try to determine how many mutual Twitter followers we had, because I think we had about the same level. I think we're flirting with about 50,000. And I would have been curious to see if there was, a divergence of 5,000 either way, or if we had 50,000 different people following each of us. Our thoughts don't always align on everything.
No, they don't, but they don't always differ on everything either. I mean, one of the things I always liked about when we did joint broadcasts is that we would find areas where we did agree. And more areas, I think, than our audiences ever expected us to. I mean, I always think of you as being kind of center left. I think of myself as being center right. I don't know how you describe yourself, but that's how I've always perceived it. And so, because I'm progressive on a lot of social issues, it doesn't surprise me that we have some overlap there. I think you're a lot more. I think you're a lot more conservative on fiscal issues than some people may think, and so maybe that's where we find some overlap also. But it's. I think in some ways I'm a little bit typecast based on the previous experience I have in politics. For anyone who didn't give me a chance in talk radio to see how I conducted my interviews, I don't know that they ever got over me being part of the Wild Rose. The Wild Rose, as we know, had some of its own problems with branding, and some of those are the reasons why I ended up leaving politics. But Twitter, you have more than me. When I left Twitter, I had 41,000. And I don't know how many of those were bots and how many of those were real. So that's the other problem.
Yeah.
Have you been able to do a scan to get rid of all the bots, or do you know if your audience is real? That's a real problem I found with Twitter, is that you put something out there and it was almost 100% vitriol, and then retweeted the most vitriolic comments. And so I never really felt in the last couple of years that it was a great place to have a good dialogue or good conversation. Not like what we got on the text lines, not like what I get in emails. So I've kind of given up on the platform. You still like it. And maybe you can tell me why you still like it, because I don't really see much value there at all.
Yeah, I'll tell you one thing, what I'm going to do right now, because we're early in our conversation. We're getting kind of like a weird audio scraping. So we're going to take you off camera just for a second. Sam's going to deal with it, because you and I are going to talk for an hour, and I want people to be able to listen to it comfortably. So Sam, we'll work with you, Danielle, to get that figured out. Danielle Smith, our guest here. You can keep the questions coming. I've got a long list. Why don't I get to another email here? It has nothing to do with what Danielle's talking about. So Sam, yeah, there we go. Okay, so Sam's going to work with her. We're just going to make sure that it sounds better. There's that bit of an audio issue. Sam, just bring your mic down while you guys are talking. Thanks. I got this email here, talk@ryanjesperson.com. I had put an invitation out to Edmonton police officers. We just referenced an email right before we headed into this interview about that high-profile incident where Edmonton police officers had been sent to an LRT, to like a transit stop, like a train stop, to basically boot out some houseless individuals that were being gifted some sandwiches and some soup by this citizen patrol, this Bear Clan patrol. Police attended the scene based on a call and sent those individuals into the cold, one of them without wearing shoes, or at least without wearing one shoe. And I had a lot to say about it. You had a lot to say about it. And we're expecting to see some sort of a statement. It's been a tough week for the Edmonton Police Service. And we do hope to speak with Edmonton Police Chief Dale McPhee coming up this week. I put the ask out to Edmonton police officers, and we received a message from one of them, and I'm really grateful for this message. And they've asked that we do not use their real name for obvious reasons, and so we're going to call this officer Anton. And I'm grateful for Anton's message, who says, I want to start by saying I've really enjoyed listening to Real Talk. It's increasingly rare to hear the range of perspectives your program showcases on issues that matter. Anton says, I'm a police officer who works in Edmonton's downtown core. I'm speaking for myself here, not on behalf of EPS. Edmonton's uncoordinated and reactive response to addressing the growing number of people who are unhoused should trouble us all. Ensuring the vulnerable have access to housing, much like other social issues that have come to the forefront over the last year, racism, poverty, drug overdoses, requires a collective effort from many agencies and institutions. It takes an entire community and multiple levels of government to make meaningful progress. When we've collectively failed in improving these problems, the outcome gets downloaded on police who tackle it on a daily basis in a very public forum. Anton says, so rather than nuanced dialogue and fact-finding where everybody accepts some accountability and commits to doing better, we defer to gut reactions to video of police interactions, and we tell ourselves we've done our part, and it's the police who have failed us. Anton says, I'm not suggesting that the officers in the LRT incident handled the situation perfectly. I bet they'd agree with that statement themselves. But they were placed in a situation with competing priorities in a system set up for failure. Having personally worked with them, I also know them to be caring, compassionate people, contrary to the assumptions of some Real Talk viewers. Giving police compassion training will not make the meaningful change we're seeking as a community. Objective, critical, non-judgmental dialogue between governments and agencies where everybody takes the appropriate level of ownership and accountability is a good starting point. Anton says, I hope this incident goes beyond police criticism and spurs real talk and real change. Thank you for your time. Keep up the good work. That from Anton, a downtown beat Edmonton police officer. Really appreciate that email. Danielle, ready to go? Improved audio? Perfect. Danielle Smith, our guest. Thanks for that. We appreciate you working with us. I want to make sure people can listen to this without the discomfort of the scraping. You know how it is. I know we have a good conversation ahead of us. Why don't we just get into it? So it's pretty par for the course to see radio hosts sent packing these days. We've seen hundreds of people laid off across Canada. We've seen some American hosts silenced, canceled, whatever phrase you want to use. It's not typical that we see somebody cancel themselves, so to speak. You said you were sick and tired of waiting to get canceled. What prompted you ultimately? What was that tipping point where you decided to walk away from such a high-profile radio gig?
Well, I must tell you, I think it's when you left. If you remember, I think the plan at Chorus was for you to switch into afternoons and be province-wide, and me to switch into mornings and be province-wide. So I think they had a plan for us both to have a pretty long and successful career there. And then I still don't know if I know entirely what went down with how you ended up exiting. I'd love it. I don't know if you shared that with your audience, but I'd love to know. But it did strike me that there was a bit of a campaign against you by Mike Nichol and his followers. And for some reason that was successful. Like I remember watching a tweet that came out. It was one of the premier staffers. And he said, if you're complaining about cancel culture and then you're trying to get someone canceled, you're part of the problem. And so I think that there's a problem on left and right. And this is what I kind of observed, is that initially, I think it was some of the more outspoken conservative voices that were running afoul of, I'll call it the hard left, because I think there's a whole range of really reasonable commentary and positioning on the left. There's a hard left that they're sort of waiting to find the one thing that will trip you up, and then it ends up getting magnified. And so I've observed that on the hard left. It was very disappointing to see that happen to you. And I guess doubly disappointing is that I thought if Ryan Jesperson, who everyone knows, career broadcaster, who everyone knows is progressive, if he can be canceled for one, and I think I heard it was like 13-second clip, if you can get canceled for one 13-second clip, and then that defines your career, then what hope is there for me to be able to manage through this? And as I took over as guest host in your slot, as they were trying to figure out what the next step was, boy, like there were people who would send me notes telling me, the one that kind of was a breaking point for me, just telling me they were sitting, listening to every word I said, to jot down something that they could write down and do a complaint about, to start a letter writing campaign to get me fired. And it's fairly relentless. I suppose the problem I saw was that there were so many people who got canceled in the last year for things that wouldn't have been cancel worthy before. I look at James Bennett, for instance, New York Times. He was sort of the very first one that caught my attention. And he was a New York Times editorial editor. And he put in a column from a senator saying, we need to call in the military to stop Antifa from burning down buildings. And that would have, in the past, been a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And if somebody objected to that opinion, there'd be a counter opinion that would be on the pages of the New York Times, and it would go back and forth. But that was enough to get him canceled. And then Wendy Mesley as well, like career veteran broadcaster, used a word she shouldn't have. She probably recognized that she shouldn't have used it. But to have her entire career now defined by that one word she said in one meeting. And so as I began to see that it isn't just a right issue, it's a right-left issue, I just felt like every time I went on the air, I was constantly self-editing and worried at the end of the day, did I say something that's going to get me fired today? So that was sort of the experience I had for almost a year. And then when I saw that you left, I didn't feel like there was going to be, I felt like, you know what, okay, well, if they won't stand behind Ryan in that circumstance, then it's only a matter of time before I say something that ends up getting me the blade as well. So that's part of the reason. I mean, I had a number of people say, why didn't you defend Ryan on the air? And you know how it is in radio, is that when somebody's gone, it's like you can never mention them again. Yeah. He becomes he who must not be named. And so I wanted you to know that I thought Mike Nichol was wrong to target you that way. Thought it was wrong for the cancel mob to come after you that way. And I feel just as strongly, left and right, that we've got to be allowed to make mistakes, and there's got to be a point of redemption to come back from them.
Yeah, I hate to give that counselor credit for it. I think there were bigger wheels turning behind the scenes. I don't think that he's powerful enough to do that himself. But I will say that it's quite interesting, and I wouldn't bring this up. It wouldn't be mine to share unless you had shared it with me and given me your blessing. But right around the time that I was suspended, September 11th, you were actually being written up too. Yeah. Both of us were facing disciplinary action. When you hear from your critics, people that were critical even of you appearing on the show here today, there are some common themes. None of this is news to you. A lot of people took issue with you bringing Kaylin Ford, the former United Conservative candidate, on your show. You know, she'd been accused of white supremacy, and obviously now she's going after legally a lot of the people that were making those assertions. An interesting story to follow there. Your what do you want to call it? Sort of your endorsement of hydroxychloroquine as a COVID-19 approach, I know was one that you shared documents that showed that the company was quite unhappy with that. There had been a series of incidents, I think, that did you perceive were infringing on your editorial freedom, or what was it?
I'll tell you what happened. I mean, it was funny. In the week I got my discipline note, it was the very day that they asked me to step in and cover for you. Yeah. And I thought I had had a pretty good week that week. It was one of the weeks that I'd had the premier on. I'd done some, I thought, really great commentary and some great guests. And so I had a sort of weekly check-in, and I thought I was going to get some praise. And instead, I got a letter of discipline. So it was prompted by and I don't know if you'll want to play it yourself, but it was prompted by a satirical video, actually, by JP Sears, who just is hysterical. He's libertarian and he does some really funny stuff. And he was just commenting on some of the things that I've been commenting on. The Alberta government has done a great job of putting some statistics out that show which group levels are the most at risk of COVID. And it's those over the age of 70, principally, and those with 3 or more pre-existing conditions. If you're under age 60 and you're healthy, you have very little risk from COVID. Your chance of getting it and having a bad outcome is very small. The cases are normally mild. So the CDC came out with very similar statistics. And so he wrote a satirical piece on that. And so I played it on the air, and people complained. And that was the reason why I got my initial letter. And then they sort of backfilled by saying, oh yeah, and there's this other thing, the hydroxychloroquine tweet in March. And there's this other thing that happened 18 months ago with Kaylin Ford. And so it felt to me, and I'm not quite sure what's happening in radio. It does seem to me that they're they always go through phases, right? So before I was hired, they had Roger Kincaid and Rob Breckenridge in the spot, and they wanted more of a entertainment style, fun, fast moving morning show, shock jock kind of and balance between lifestyle topics and hard news. When they hired me, I think they went back to a bit of a hard news approach. But they still wanted someone with strong opinions. But I think that there's a change now happening in mainstream media where they do want someone who's going to be able to conduct panel discussions without sharing their own opinion. Like I look at someone like Rosie Barton or Vashi Capella, so I think do a great job, or even Mercedes Stevenson, who is, and David Aiken, who are within Global. I think that's more the style of interview that they want, is somebody who you can't really tell where they fall on the political spectrum because they give it to both sides equally, and they give sort of a balanced kind of commentary sum up at the end, and that's not me. So I think what happened in the end is that with the changing desire to turn Global into something a little bit different, then I was just the wrong fit. My style was, I think, one that was just not on brand for Chorus. So you'd make a choice there, right? Like if you're not on brand with Chorus, then you're or with your employer, then you're constantly having to self-edit and try to change the way you do things. And ultimately you have to decide, is this consistent with who I am and my brand? And there was a clash there, so I had to leave.
So, and let's acknowledge too that it's entirely different stakes hosting an exploratory type opinionated talk show during a pandemic. Because
Totally.
I can already guarantee, and I wanted to let you know, by the way, just of interest in conducting an interview, every time you and I would talk, and I'm following that same approach to this, I'm not reading the comments during this interview. It throws me off during interviews. I want to focus on doing a good interview. I don't want to focus on appealing to masses that have their own opinions on how conversations should go. But I would go so far as to almost guarantee that the statement you just made 3 minutes ago, that relatively speaking, younger people experience, more gentle, that wasn't your word, but more mild symptoms. People are probably already pissed. I'm not pushing back on that. People were pissed. I talked to Drew Barnes, that I talked to Lieutenant Colonel retired David Redman. Other people are going to be pissed that I talked to an Antifa activist out of Portland last week that wants to defund the police. I'm not afraid of having those conversations. I think it's important. I think we need to have them responsibly. But there are times when someone with a position or a pulpit like this, or like you had, or that you'll have moving forward, and we'll talk about your plan, that we use it responsibly. The hydroxychloroquine thing, I know, got you in a lot of hot water internally and from corporate. What about outside of there? Do you regret, in hindsight, sharing that tweet? I mean, it made news when you deleted it. I have to assume you were ordered to delete it.
Yeah. I was ordered to delete it. I regret overstating it. I regret calling it a cure. We may have found a cure for COVID because that overstates it. But what I am frustrated by with the mainstream media is that mainstream media seems to be taking its cues from social media. So Sundar Pichai at Google, who operates YouTube, Jack Dorsey at Twitter, Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, they have a corporate position, and it's on the record, that if anyone says anything that contradicts Dr. Anthony Fauci, they will consider it misinformation, and they will not allow it to be platformed. And so what you have is, I agree, like there's some crazy stuff out there. And some things that you don't want on a mainstream media platform. But doctors who are testing out therapeutics and having good success of it, just because Dr. Fauci hasn't put the rubber stamp on it, doesn't mean that they should be deplatformed. And so in the intervening period, I actually just saw another article today. There's a Dr. Zelensky in New York. He's a Jewish doctor serving the Jewish community. He just gave his most recent results because he's had 3,000 COVID patients. 1,000 of them were high risk. And so he put them on a combination of hydroxychloroquine, zinc, and azithromycin. And only 15 ended up in hospital, and only 3 of them died. And so that's worthy of us in the media saying what's going on there. I think what he discovered is hydroxychloroquine itself isn't the treatment. It's this combination that allows for zinc to work to kill the virus, and then azithromycin to treat whatever bacterial infections happen after the fact. But it shouldn't be verboten for us to have that conversation. He's gone on to say, We now find that blood thinners also have some success. Steroids have some success. Ivermectin has some success. In the normal world, pre-COVID, we would be able to talk about both. Having a discussion about vaccination does not preclude also having therapeutics, especially as we're now being told variants are going to keep COVID around for a long time, that we're not going to have everybody here vaccinated for, who knows, maybe till 2022. So what do you do in the meantime? So if you've got a bunch of people who are going to get COVID and you know that they will, do you suppress information?
Well, and here's the thing,
what might treat them?
This is what I was saying is I think that it was new for me and I'm sure for you as well, although I won't speak for you, that to host an opinion-based exploratory talk show in the course of a pandemic is a completely different exercise than anybody was used to. And so veteran broadcasters and storytellers and journalists is one thing. Talk host is different. And because, and like you're saying, well, are we going to deprive people of this information? I think what one of the big concerns is that it either empowers or emboldens people to take action that may be quite counterproductive, not only to their own health, but also to public health. I mean, we saw it happen when the Trump administration, when former President Trump would make comments, about, and then you'd hear about people injecting bleach into their systems or drinking. I mean, I'm not saying that these are the brightest lights in the room, but at the same time, it creates problems. And I think that's probably obviously one of the biggest reasons why you face so much fire for your statement. When it comes back to retrospect, though, would you do it differently? I mean, that's really the question, because let me put this in front of you. This is a different way of asking the question. Greaseball's watching in, and Greaseball on Twitter says, can you please ask Danielle how somebody who's had a bi-weekly newspaper column for over a decade and has hosted her own radio show for years can honestly claim she's being silenced? What would you say to Greaseball?
Well, I would say that I had probably 24 topics and guests that I just were not allowed to put on, that I was not allowed to really pursue any of this discussion about what therapeutics might be out there. And I think that's, to me, when we look back on how the medical establishment handled this pandemic and how the media handled this pandemic, what I didn't want to do, I didn't want to be part of suppressing information that could have helped people, because that's the other side of it. I mean, no one is saying that you should go out and self-medicate. No one has ever said that. But what we should be saying is that if doctors are finding that there are treatments that are working while we're waiting for vaccination to be fully rolled out, then why wouldn't we arm doctors with that information? I mean, to this day, if you look at what the Alberta Health Protocol is, it's basically go home, bed rest, drink fluids, take Tylenol if you have a headache, and hope you don't have to be hospitalized. But all the doctors who've had success in treating patients have had early intervention to make sure it doesn't deteriorate to that point. So for me, I would say that those kinds of conversations need to take place. And in the past, we used to be able to. Like, I don't know, you're talking about the pre-COVID world. In the pre-COVID world, my goodness, I had all kinds of doctors on about promising new drug breakthroughs and discussions about how it might help people. So why does that become verboten when we need to talk about it most? That's the thing that bothered me. So my big issue, I think, I was able to navigate pretty well any other issue that came up. And there's been some really tough issues that we've had to deal with in the last couple of years, as you know. I feel pretty good about being able to navigate that and making sure that we're putting moderate voices on the air. I just don't understand how it is the media became essentially the mouthpiece for government messages. Like, that's not our role. The media role is to listen to what the government says and to, yes, we have to push the message out, but we also have to challenge it and we have to analyze it. We do that on every other announcement that they put out. So why wouldn't we do that same kind of challenging now? Why would that be verboten? And maybe you can tell me. Maybe this is my misunderstanding of what happens.
I feel like we're doing our own thing here. I mean, I feel like we're building a modern media company based on past experience and looking forward, and it's a completely different landscape. I'm intrigued to hear you talk about hosting a moderate program, because a lot of people wouldn't describe your previous show on Chorus Radio as moderate. Now, to be fair, you would welcome people like, I know you welcome, for example, Max Fawcett, who a lot of people in the oil and gas scheme. I mean, I know that you've been open to different ideas on your show, that's for sure. But you also opened the door to some people that, quite frankly, I closed the door to, and one of them in particular was John Carpe. For me, the straw that broke the camel's back was when he compared the pride flag to the Nazi swastika. You had John on several times after that comment. Why did you continue to offer him an opportunity to join you on the show?
He never repeated that comment, and he was always. But he never repeated it on my show. I mean, I guess this is the question that I have, right? Does one sentence that somebody says disqualify them from ever doing anything meaningful again in life ever again?
But he never apologized for it, right? And he invoked Nazi Germany in describing equal rights for gays and lesbians. I mean, to me, it was just almost, I don't know if I want to go so far as saying unforgivable, but he never asked for forgiveness. And that stuck with me.
Let me agree with you on this. The only time you should talk about Nazis is when you're talking about real Nazis from the historical era. The only time you should make a Holocaust reference is if you're talking about the actual Holocaust. It is without precedent. And so I would say anyone who was calling right-wing politicians Hitler or fascist or Nazis, they fall into the same category. And I think they're both extremists. So I don't tolerate or accept that that's an appropriate way to describe anyone. And so, yes, made a big mistake. And I think he did apologize for it, if I do remember. But a lot of times, I mean, remember, he's got 11 staff lawyers working for him now. And so many times when I would have the JCCF on, it would be Jay Cameron who would come on to talk about the different initiatives that they've taken forward. Because quite frankly, there's only a few organizations out there, the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, the Canadian Constitution Foundation, Civil Liberties Associations. They're the only ones that are really fighting against some of these more severe restrictions that are taking place across the country. So that would be the reason why.
This brings us to a topical, I know you and I are going to completely disagree on this. Grace Life Church holding another packed service yesterday in Parkland County, just west of Edmonton. If I remember correctly, I think that the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms is actually representing them, if I remember correctly. Yeah. Their pastor's in jail right now. You've described him as the jailed pastor in your interview with Jason Kenney on Friday. By the way, you did... I thought you were going to go a little easier on Kenny on Friday. That was actually
so
good.
Did my mom. My mom's not happy with me.
No, you gave it to him. And in such a bizarre twist of events, you actually had me agreeing with Jason Kenney a couple times through that interview, which hasn't happened in a long time. So you accomplished something there. But in all seriousness, you've talked about jailed pastors. You're invoking kind of the religious angle on this. In my mind, it's cut and dried an issue of public health. How can you support a congregation, a community that repeatedly defies public health orders in the middle of a pandemic?
Well, I guess I think that you have to look at the data. And as much as we keep getting scary computer model projections, the data has shown that we've seen a 77% decrease in COVID cases around the world in the last 6 weeks. We've seen a continued decline since. I mean, when the government came up with its scary projection saying that we could get to as high as 10,000 cases per day and 3,500 in hospital, that was just 4 weeks ago. And we were at about 600 in hospital at the time. So it's dropped off now to 321 in hospital, and 50 of which 53 are in ICU. Now, my frame of reference on this always was, we don't want our hospital system to get overwhelmed. That used to be the frame of reference for government. That's what we were told when this whole process began. But they keep moving the goalposts on us. So I would say, looking at the data, it becomes pretty clear that based on some of the earlier goalposts they were trying to get us to reach, we should be seeing these restrictions come down. And so I don't know if you've watched Pastor Coates' speech, his sermon.
Yeah, I have.
From a week ago. And I think he's not a anti-lockdown, anti-government guy. He's a real law and order guy.
Oh, no,
he believes
I don't know.
in the role of government. But can I just say one thing?
Yeah.
What he disagrees with is he doesn't think that the government has the right to come into his church and tell him how to conduct his service. And that's what he's objected to. He's not telling you go out, don't wear masks, and tear down the state or anything like that. He's just saying, you know what, this is my domain and you shouldn't be here.
Yeah, but they kind of are. I mean, and we played some excerpts from Pastor Jacob Spence's address yesterday. He's the one that delivered the message, and he is. I mean, he's speaking mockingly of government and comparing Jason Kenney to Pontius Pilate, and he's comparing Pastor Coates' imprisonment to the trials of Christ and the apostles. I mean, it's supercharged in my mind fundraising language. But I want to go back to the trends, and you take a look at sort of how we're able to make sure that we don't overburden our health system, it's because people are buying in. It's because of these measures. That's why the numbers are dropping. And to me, I believe that there's a freedom to practice religion, obviously. But when we're talking here about freedoms, what's being left on the altar, so to speak, is the care and concern for our fellow human beings. And Pastor Coates is, in fact, encouraging his congregants to gather together without masks. He's laying the foundation for it to happen. He's encouraging them to continue to gather when realistically he could adhere to the 15% of fire code regulation. They have streaming capabilities. That's how I'm able to pull their sermon to show our viewers. They figured it out. And to me, it's more a matter of principle. It's a matter of defiance. And to me, it slaps every other Canadian in the face.
I guess because I've looked at other jurisdictions where they haven't come through with quite as many extreme restrictions, I guess I differ with you in looking at how the lockdowns work or don't work. I mean, I look at places like Florida, South Dakota, Sweden. They've got the same trend on the course that this virus goes. So that says to me that the virus will do what the virus will do. There seems to be, again, going back to how illiterate we are on medical issues. And if you talk to epidemiologists, they'll tell you a couple things. They'll tell you that viruses do this. They have a cycle where they rise and then they fall off. You get the impression listening to politicians that you're going to have exponential growth forever and ever and ever until everybody's infected, and it's going to result in massive death. That's just not how viruses work in the real world. So we've gone through, and if you look at our own stats in Alberta, we peaked December 4th. Now, there were some small restrictions that came through before that, but the major lockdown didn't happen until December 13th. And we know that there's sort of a 2-week delay. So the virus had already peaked prior to the restrictions coming in. They may have helped, sure, I'll take that. But we were already seeing that because we're in respiratory virus season, it has a trend. It peaks in December, January, and falls off by February. So I would say that the government should have matched their restriction policy with that. And so that's the real problem that they have, is that they're slow in easing the restrictions. You've got people, and I think I've seen some of the arguments on this. You can have 1,000 people, or I don't know, 2,000 people go through a Costco in a day. I don't even know what their what number of people they serve, but you can't congregate with people that you know. And so I understand the arguments. I think that that jailing a pastor, I'm trying to figure out where else that is happening in the world. I don't know that they've ever gone that far. Jail seems to me to be a bit of, especially since Ryan, like, look what they did.
But Danielle, he's been cited, he's been arrested and released. They've been written tickets. I mean, nothing's working with the guy. He continues to act in defiance of a public health order. To me, it's like, technically it's jailing a pastor. Yeah. But if I was a restaurateur or a nightclub owner or if I owned any other business that was, getting people to basically completely ignore public health orders, enforceable public health orders, in a highly prominent scenario, I would expect to have law enforcement intervene, whether it's a pastor or not. I don't think the fact he's a pastor really has anything to do with it.
I guess to me, I believe that you should be doing penalties on the basis of risk and on the basis of harm. I think the approach that we've taken with ticketing and jailing has been inappropriate from the beginning. If you want me to tell you who I think you would want to focus your ticketing and jailing on, you would want to focus it on somebody who is sick and then goes out and infects other people knowingly because they're not taking precautions. If you've got somebody who's healthy and they have a congregation of people who come together and they're healthy and there aren't any cases of COVID that come out of that, where's the public harm? That's what I'm saying. You're talking about a potential harm.
Yeah, but I mean, if you talk to anybody in healthcare too, bigger picture, they're always going to say preventative measures are better than reactive measures. And people that feel healthy can still carry the COVID virus. I mean, we acknowledge we're not going to agree on this, and I don't want to spend all our time on this, but I do want to move on. There was a high-profile rally last weekend in Calgary at Chinook Centre Mall, yesterday at the Alberta Legislature grounds. You're going to be hosting an event tonight for Western Standard. You're going to be interviewing retired Lieutenant Colonel David Redmond, who I spoke to a couple of weeks ago. He's big on basically, obliterating COVID restrictions, basically, which was a big focus of that demonstration here in Edmonton yesterday. Now, here's the thing. This demonstration also included people holding tiki torches, which are a pretty supercharged image right now, anti-Semitic signs, QAnon paraphernalia. A lot of these people, and I think it's fair to say this because I read the text lines when you and I would host or when I'd fill in for you. A lot of these people are pretty big fans of yours. What do you make of what you saw at the legislature yesterday?
Well, Ryan, come on.
Do you not think that's fair?
Outrageous. That's outrageous.
You don't
for
think
you to
that
say
you,
that?
You don't
No,
think so?
I don't think that. No, I don't think that. What I do think is, and this is part of the reason why I agreed to host this event tonight with David Redmond, because I've been invited to go to lockdown rallies and I've said no. And he's been invited to go to lockdown rallies and he said no. Like, I'm a law and order person. I really am. I don't want to see the government aggressively go after people the way they have after the pastor, but I think people should follow the rules. I mean, I have a restaurant. I wear my mask. When I'm serving tables, I wash my hands with sanitizer and in the back regularly. We seat 2 people at a table. We've got them socially distanced. I'm a responsible person, and I think that people expect that. And so I wouldn't go to those rallies because I think they're doing it the wrong way. If you want to get your message out, I think doing it the right way, like the way David Redmond is doing, where he comes onto shows and he conducts a forum and he does it by Zoom and he pushes for an easing of restrictions. And I think we have to do it slowly. Like even in places like Sweden, they didn't say no restrictions whatsoever. They gave recommendations. I think they ended up reducing the number of people who could gather at various public events, and also in looking
Sweden's
at
getting hammered though now. I mean, Sweden's getting hammered on fatality rates, and you mentioned South Dakota.
No, I don't think so.
Yeah, I mean,
you should have a look.
Neighboring countries was it Norway that has soldiers on the border? Sweden's right. Yeah, and I mean, you mentioned South Dakota. I only know this from the Premier's numbers. Jason Kenney told you on Friday that if you took South Dakota's death rate and applied it to Alberta, we'd have 10,000 deaths as opposed to the 1,800 we do. I mean, I don't know that those jurisdictions are really great ones to highlight.
Well, I don't know that Quebec is a great one to highlight either, or New York that had the greatest lockdowns and they've had the worst death rates. I mean, if you look at Quebec is only twice our population and they're responsible for, what are they at now? I don't know, 8,000 deaths in the country. So this is the issue. I know the politicians want to show that they're doing something. And so they show lockdowns as a way of saying, hey, look what we're doing and it's going to have this outcome. But you can look at some extreme lockdown states and they have the worst records of any jurisdiction. So look, I'm not going to say ease all the restrictions now. What I am saying is it's a bit absurd that the only way I can see my parents is for them to come and have lunch at my restaurant. Like I should be able to go back to having the 10-person cohort that I had. I don't have that many close friends, that many people that I need to see one-on-one. I want to just go back to having my 10-person cohort. I want to go back to having my 5-person yoga class. I think the issue is that we've got to start treating adults like adults and also talking about personal responsibility for those who have pre-existing conditions. Those who have pre-existing conditions, they're going to have to continue to take extra precautions, no matter whether we have COVID or whatever it is that COVID turns into in the next influenza season, or if influenza comes back, because it seems like COVID blocked it out this year, or if they've got cancer and they don't have an immune system, there are certain people who will always have to take extra precautions. So David Redmond's approach is find a way to focus on the most vulnerable so that we reduce the death rates, find a way to support those who are in the community so that they can also be protected. And this is why I say therapeutics come into the mix as well. Is that if somebody does get diagnosed, you want to do something more than just say, gosh, I hope you don't have to go to the hospital. So I think we need to have a more balanced discussion on that. So I'm not saying throw all the restrictions out. I don't want you to mischaracterize what I'm saying. What I am saying is that we have to find ways of allowing more businesses to get reopened, more family connections to be able to get restarted. And the Premier has to be more in sync, I think, on where he was in October and November of last year.
One of the interesting things, I think, when we talk about comorbidities, and I know this is a big part of the retired Lieutenant Colonel's platform, he described it on our show. We had some physicians respond to it, the idea of quarantining long-term care workers and keeping people over 60 in particular circumstances. Upon fact check, when you look at comorbidities of COVID-19, they're talking about things like obesity, diabetes. I reference a piece in Post Media, kind of a fact check from Timothy Caulfield out of of the U of A School of Public Health Policy Law, talking about 75% of Albertans would qualify as those having potential comorbidities. So the whole personal responsibility or personal freedom thing, I think, has proven to be an ineffective approach to managing COVID-19. Now, I have said on the show, and I believe this to be true, that I don't think that there's one right way to do it. And I do think that governments in all jurisdictions face very significant challenges. When you talk about public health, when you talk about the health of the economy, I think it's easy to sit and take shots at a government. I think it's easy to sit and take shots at health professionals, chief medical officers of health, without being in a position to have to make those decisions. It's a remarkably difficult job, but I do think it's important to adhere to the science on that. I want to ask you, I'm a little surprised that you said that it's outrageous that I talked about some of the people that would be big fans of yours. I don't mean it as an insult. I just mean it as like, I think.
Of course you meant it as an
No,
insult.
put it this way. Put it this way.
Come on,
If you and I went to the Alberta legislature yesterday, and you and I both still had radio shows, and we said, do you listen to Jespo or Danielle Smith? I mean, who do you think that they would say they listen? That's all I'm saying. I'm not trying to be an asshole, but what I am saying, I am curious to know if you're concerned about people invoking those types of images. I mean, like tiki torches at the Alberta legislature were 6 weeks or so removed from January 6th at DC. Can you see something like that happening here? Are you concerned about it?
It's outrageous. This is the point. We all know now what is tiki light symbols because of what happened in the United States. And so, of course, it's outrageous that they would carry those in a public protest. I don't know. Like I live in the center, Ryan. I know you have some misconceptions about where I situate myself on the political spectrum, but my show was always about, can I bring somebody on who's on the center left, somebody on the center right, and can I find some place to agree with them on any number of issues? I mean, my last guest was Corey Hogan, for heaven's sakes, because he was my first guest when I became a full-time host. And we talked about the situation that Jason Kenney finds himself in this province. And here's where I think Jason Kenney is in real trouble, is that there's a slice of his support base that want him to take stronger action on the Alberta agenda items. They want us to collect our own personal income tax. They want us to have our own police force and our own pension system. And I think what they're seeing is that the Premier doesn't seem to be all that interested in any of those issues. So where I see the Premier is in trouble is that it's actually the autonomous group in Alberta. And I don't know how big that's going to grow. I think the highest I've ever seen the separatist sentiment has been about 25%. I don't know what it's at right now. But that group, if they don't feel like they can get some better, a better balance in our federation with Ottawa, they're not going to vote for him. They're going to vote for the Wild Rose Independence Party, or vote for the Maverick Party federally, or any of the other number of independence parties that are developing. And he's going to lose, because if you lose 10% of the vote in Calgary, you lose seats to the NDP. You lose that in Edmonton, Edmonton goes 100% NDP. So I think the biggest risk for Kenney is more the autonomous crowd. I don't think it's the issues that you're raising. I think that people just want him to get tougher with Ottawa so that we can get pipelines built, so we can get more respect for our resource sector, so people can start getting back to work. I just don't see that as being a very large element of the opposition right now.
You said on Friday that you recently reconnected with and reconciled with Ezra Levant, the founder of the co-founder of Rebel Media, at an event. First of all, I'm just curious what event it was and what you guys talked about. What do you make of what Ezra's doing at Rebel Media? And if you were a politician still, would you do interviews with Rebel Media?
You know, Ezra, I wouldn't do interviews with Ezra, and part of it is that I think he has not been able to create in his alternative media outlet a moderate space in the center. I don't feel like he's interviewing from both sides. Like you'll be prepared to interview on both sides. I look at you as trying to create a forum to bring people together, and that's what I like. I mean, I like the alternative media that isn't too far left or too far right. And so, no, but probably True North. I mean, I think True North is doing some good work as well with Candace Malcolm and with Andrew Lawton. I think they've got other opinion hosts who are associated with them too, like Anthony Fury and others. So there are some that are alt media that I think are doing great work. And so, yes, but Ezra and I, we were not friends. We were frenemies when I was at university, because I started into politics as the campus president for the Progressive Conservative Club on campus at the U of C. And he was with the Reform at the time. So I entered politics as a progressive conservative, and we did not see eye to eye. But he was best friends with my first husband, and so I've known him for a number of years. He blasted me really well when I left the Wild Rose to join Jim Prentice when at the time he was at Sun TV, which was a national talk show that he had. And we didn't talk for 6 years, but it was the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms, an event that John Carpe held. He had me moderate, giving an award for freedom of speech to a left-wing professor. It's funny, we had a whole conversation at the table about why Marxism was the better strategy. That was the position of her and her husband. But she ran afoul of the academia on a completely different issue involving Indigenous matters. And she's a left-winger. And so John gave her an award. So Ezra was there because he's been a free speech advocate for some time. We decided to bury the hatchet. But that's the whole point, right? I mean, this is the place where I think we need to be. We need to be at a place where left and right can talk to each other about areas of common interest so that we can continue to have the arguments about areas where we disagree to see if there's any way that we can get to some kind of further agreement. I don't know that I like the world that we're moving to, where only lefties will go on left-wing media and only righties will go on right-wing media. If you end up with that kind of polarization, you'll never find the center again. We'll never be able to talk to each other again.
I completely agree with you, but here you are leaving AM radio and heading over to locals.com, which, sort of pulls you out of, to a certain degree. I mean, it's a whole new, we can talk big picture about where media is going and where talk hosts are going and how people are going to get their content. And there's that type of conversation, but you're taking yourself out of the mainstream and putting yourself behind, I don't know if I say behind a paywall, but people subscribe at locals.com if they want to hear or read what you have to say. What can you do at locals.com that you couldn't do on AM radio?
Oh, wow. I mean, I can read the people who are engaging with me, number one. I mean, I'm not dreading seeing my notifications to see if somebody has a comment to share, because on Twitter, you can't do that. I stopped looking at my notifications over a year ago, and I stopped using Twitter over a year ago. Actually, it was just my producer who was pushing out my show content, because it's vitriolic. I mean, I don't know if you take a pause. I don't think you do. This is the nice thing about alt media, right? You don't have to work your way around news. You don't have to work your way around commercials. But that's why when I asked you if you still wanted to have me on, is because it was just vicious and awful. The comments on your feed that people were responding to, saying that you were going to have me on. The difference is I posted that you were going to be on my show as well. I had some people say, Ryan's not my cup of tea. I tried him out when he was on Jed, and I don't find I agree with him that much. But others who said, oh, great, I'm looking forward to seeing that. So I think you'll have some of my viewers who are tuning in and watching this as well. But I didn't get anything like the nastiness that you did on Twitter. So I think that there's a different culture in Locals than there is on Twitter. And I think that the fact that you have to subscribe, and it's not even a big fee, what Dave Rubin did when he established that is he just wanted to have a price of entry so that, number one, it can't be an anonymous Twitter bot, for heaven's sakes, because you've got to have a real name and a real contact and a real way to pay. So that would be one thing. But also look at Dave Rubin. I mean, Dave Rubin is gay, he's married, he's Californian, he's a registered Democrat. And he just left the left because he found that the left was engaging in too much cancel culture and pushing legitimate views out of the public sphere.
Do you think that, sorry to interrupt, do you think that Twitter and about a dozen other social media platforms were right to deplatform Donald Trump?
Oh, gosh, no. No, I don't. I mean, if you can deplatform the president of the United States, then you have more power than any elected leader.
But he who incited a riot, an act of domestic terrorism, right? It wasn't like they didn't like his, they didn't like his Reaganomics or his Obamacare, right? It was. Does Jack Dorsey have journalism credentials? Does Mark Zuckerberg have journalism credentials? Does Sundar Pichai? Like, who are they? Do you need journalism credentials though to stop Trump from inciting riots? So should every media outlet have not carried any Trump interviews as well? I mean, I think they got to a point where they did shut it down. Right, that was kind of the whole. That was the final straw for Twitter, was when Trump posted that video, right? Calling the rioters very good people and all that. Well, I guess what I would say is that I don't like the world that we have right now, where you've got Twitter, Facebook, and Google essentially
dictating the coverage for mainstream media. Like I'm not American. I can't vote for a Republican or a Democrat candidate. I always covered American politics from the perspective of what is best for Alberta and what works for Alberta. So Donald Trump is gone, and now we have to look at Joe Biden. But the system remains where Twitter and Facebook and YouTube can decide what we are allowed to see. Because here's what happens, and I noticed this a lot over the last year, is that if someone comes out with a statement that they don't like, then it gets canceled, and then the mainstream media decides not to cover it at all. And so if you can have, why should the mainstream media be dictated to by three tech giants? I don't think that that's legitimate either. I think if they are going to make the argument that they're essentially just a platform and they're neutral, then they got to be neutral. And if they're not going to be neutral, if they're going to be a publisher, then they should get regulated the same way that the mainstream broadcasters get regulated. I don't think you can have it both ways. So that's my big issue with Twitter, Facebook, and Google, is I feel like people are smart and people are able to ferret out what's real and what's not. They're able to ferret out what's true and what's not.
I don't know
and the
about
only
that.
way you can figure. Well, I have more faith in people than you do.
You have more faith in people than I, because I'm paying attention to the evidence that shows that a lot of people have real problems discerning what's true and what's real. Let me ask you this: we're going to run out of time. We're up against the clock, and there's a million things I'd like to talk to you about. But on Wednesday at 9 a.m., a couple of days from now at 9 a.m., I'll talk to University of Calgary economist Blake Schaefer, and I'll talk to University of Texas at Austin researcher Joshua Rhodes about what we can learn from Texas. Their energy woes, their supply issues. You've written a piece that's proven to be highly controversial.
I wouldn't even know, because
I'm not sure if you're not on
Twitter,
Twitter, but not everybody appreciates you essentially, declaring the death blow for wind and solar. Let me quote you. You say wind and solar had their chance to demonstrate they were the only answer. They failed. Now let's get serious about real options so we aren't the next ones worried about freezing to death. When you write a piece like that, if you had the option to kill wind and solar for good, I mean, is that kind of the goal? Do you have a personal axe to grind against wind and solar?
Did you didn't read the sentence where I said wind and solar
100%.
have to be able to provide
absolutely, and you talk about nuclear, and you talk,
but
I'm just saying, I'm saying big picture. Do you like? When it comes to sort of where you'd stack things up, we could talk about coal, natural gas, nuclear, wind, solar. Are you most cynical, or would you rather take wind and solar and get it off the table? I get the impression that that's the case.
Oh, I'm only fighting back against those who say wind and solar are the only options. And you must know that is a strain of writing out there. That a lot of the green activists, they don't like nuclear. They don't like hydroelectric power. Hydroelectric is not considered green in the United States. They don't like blue hydrogen, which we'll be producing here from natural gas. I interviewed Annemie Paul on that. She doesn't think that should be part of the mix. It seems like all roads lead back to wind and solar. And if that's the case, then tell me the vision. And I've talked to somebody, Keith Brooks, I think it was, from Environmental Defense, and he told me the vision. He said 100% of our energy needs should be on the electrical grid. And the electrical grid should be all of our home heating. It should be all of our transportation needs. It should be all of our electricity. And it should be 100% wind and solar with battery backup. Well, if that's the vision, then we have to test it against reality. Does it work? Does wind operate around the clock year round when we have temperatures of -30? It does not. Does solar operate when we have temperatures of -30 and snow-covered panels? It does not. Do we have any battery backup for either of those two? No, we don't. The backup for wind and solar happens to be natural gas. No one has built battery backup into their systems. So here's what I would say is that Greta Thunberg can go around the world saying that we're all going to die, we're going extinct in 10 years. Why is it controversial for us to say we actually would die? Because it's true, we actually would die if we had 100% wind and solar power. It does not work in this environment.
And I haven't
we have to
seen,
be realistic
I haven't seen anybody that I would deem to be credible that has suggested that we could entirely rely on a system supported by wind and solar. And I think probably the idea is that, number one, Texas ignored a lot of warnings about some of the climate susceptibility realities that were in place on their grid. Number two, being off the grid of the rest of the United States. And then number three, I think just the declaration that if wind and solar can't supply 100% of the power, then it's not worth looking into or relying upon. I don't have a strong position here on any of this. But I can see trends toward jurisdictions like Alberta looking to diversify its energy supply and being more sustainable, being more green where it can. I think you're right. There are some issues around backup power, around storage, but I haven't even seen advocates for renewables deny that.
Well, but they haven't produced it either. And part of the reason why we don't have it is there's a bit of a problem that when you start talking about battery backup, it's expensive. And guess what? You need to mine a lot of rare earth metals for that too. And a lot of the extreme environmentalists are kind of opposed to mining also. So this is the real problem that we have. And understand this. Like I gave wind and solar a fair run. I really did. But when even Michael Schellenberger, who wrote Apocalypse Now, when he looked at the evidence, he's a greenie. He's very concerned about climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. When he looked at the evidence, he said, no, nuclear is the option. Wind and solar can't do it. You can read his, I don't know if you talked to him, but you can read his book. And then even Michael Moore, I mean, he's no righty. He and Jeff Gibbs went out and did that Planet of the Humans. And they came to the exact same conclusion that you actually can't create wind and solar without having a base of fossil fuels, because you need the fossil fuels for the backup. And you need the fossil fuels to be able to develop all the resources to be able to make solar and wind and the battery.
I talked to Ket and Joshi after that film came out. That was a really interesting one. We're out of time, but I want to ask you this in closing. I remember the last time that, you and I would often joke or sort of like glibly and lightly talk about a potential return to politics for you. And you would always do what you just did right there. And you would laugh and you'd shrug it off and you would say to me, and you'd say, which I never really believed that you believed, but you said you would say, I might still be unelectable. I remember you said to me when you declared that you were leaving your talk show, immediately people started to speculate that you might be running for mayor of Calgary, that you might be seeking the leadership of the Wild Rose Independence Party to re-enter provincial politics. Have you ruled out a return to politics, or quite frankly, are you returning to politics?
Well, I am unelectable. You know that, Ryan. I'm even more unelectable.
Do you honestly believe that you are?
Because of the environment that we're in. I mean, I love freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, free enterprise. That's who I am. I'm freedom at my core. And the general public isn't right now. If you look at the poll results, I understand why Jason Kenney's made the decisions that he has, because the harder the lockdown measures and the more restrictions on people's freedom, the higher the poll results for a politician. So if I went into an election and said, hey, look, next time this happens, we're going to take David Redmond's approach. And we are not going to lock you down, and we're not going to force your businesses closed. Look what happened in Florida. Look what happened in Sweden. Look what happened in South Dakota. We can do that. I don't think I'd get elected, because I couldn't do this to people, honestly. I'm not hardwired to restrict freedoms this way. And until people want freedom back, then I don't think I'm the right politician for the time. So I've got to go do something else for a while. And so it may well, so I'm not the right talk radio host for the time either. And so if I have to go and do other things, I serve at my restaurant on the weekends. That gives me great joy, and it has for the last 3 years. If I run, I'd be thinking probably of running for our local council in High River if a vacancy opens up. My aspirations are quite small. And if
you versus Craig Snodgrass, the mayor of High River, in a mayoral race would be fascinating.
See, that's not what I'm saying. I love Craig Snodgrass. He's the best.
Really?
He's the best. If there's a council position that opens up, I don't even have aspirations for the top job. I just want to serve my community. I want to be able to do it in a meaningful way. I don't think we can change things at the federal level. I don't think we can change things even at the provincial level, really. And I don't want to play a role in splitting the right again. I did that once. It resulted in the NDP. I'm very frustrated with Kenney, as you can probably tell from my interview with him on Friday. I want him to take some action that will keep the conservative movement united. I hope I can play a role in keeping the conservative movement united, but I'm not going to do anything that is going to cause more division. I'm just going to be serving I'm just serving Eggs Benedict on Saturday and Sunday at my railcar restaurant.
Somebody wrote into the show and said, I just looked up Danielle's restaurant. They say I can't stand her politics, but it looks like a great concept.
It's beautiful.
Maybe they'll be swinging by.
I'm telling you, come on down.
2 words, Jason Kenney or Rachel Notley, who wins in 2023?
At the moment, Rachel Notley.
I'm
sad to say. Yeah,
Danielle
Jason Kenney
Smith
needs to take it. I'll leave it at that then, Ryan. Thank you so much for having me
thanks for joining us. I appreciate the conversation, Danielle.
Yeah, appreciate it too.
That's
Take it
Danielle
easy.
Smith. Yeah, you bet. Hosted her last show on Chorus Radio on Friday. You can check out what she's doing at daniellesmith.ca. I like this from Brian out of Southwest Calgary using the hashtag RealTalkRJ. Says, great discussion. I like how you two can respectfully agree to disagree on certain topics. That's been the case for years. I know many of you have no time for what she has to say. I know some of you are taking every single word she says like gospel, and that's the thing when you're a public commentator. That's the way it goes. I'm going to take some time to debrief after that interview, and we'll offer some thoughts on that tomorrow. But I do appreciate Danielle's availability. That's her first interview since she said goodbye to that talk host. Interviews like this are made possible by the team at Local Waste. They love to talk trash with you, and they'd love to earn your business. They've been in the business of going head-to-head against the big international garbage guys for years, and they're proudly headquartered, locally owned and operated here in Edmonton, Alberta. You can check them out at localwaste.ca. And don't forget to tune in this Friday for Trash Talk, presented by Local Waste. The team at Dairy Queens in Northwest Edmonton and Sherwood Park want to thank you for your ongoing business. They sent me a note over the weekend that said, we do have something coming up, another cool offering for Real Talkers. But in the meantime, Jespo, just let them know that we've got our 4-piece chicken strip basket going right now for $6.99. 4 all white meat chicken strips served with crispy fries and your choice of dipping sauce for a limited time. They said, if you want to mention something other than how awesome we are. Well, all right. We'll mention the chicken strip basket for $6.99, as well as how awesome they are at Dairy Queens of Northwest Edmonton and Sherwood Park. The team at Clean Air Club wants to make sure that your family can breathe easier and save money. They encourage you right now, number 1, to think about the last time you changed your furnace filter. And number 2, to immediately go, as you have that disgusting realization wash over you that you're breathing air that's been running through a filthy filter for weeks or maybe even months. At cleanairclub.ca, they sign you up. They get you the filter that you need. They drop it off right at your door, below prices you're going to pay elsewhere. And, of course, you and your family can breathe easy with Clean Air Club. Thanks to our sponsors for their ongoing support of Real Talk and the conversations we host. Now, of course, it's been an exciting week for those that pay keen attention to the stars, the planets, and the exploration of our solar system. That Mars Perseverance rover landing late last week, a remarkable feat. Now we try to determine what can we learn from this. It's a huge pleasure to welcome to the program a renowned solar system specialist, a science communicator. She's a planetary geologist, Emily Lakdawalla. Thank you so much for making time for us, and welcome to Real Talk.
Thank you for having me.
May I first of all compliment you on your t-shirt. That's absolutely fantastic. How much fun have you been having for the last few days?
I've been having fun for the last few days. I do have to say that I can't go forward in this interview without asserting that vaccines save lives. COVID is a huge public health threat, and everybody should stay home as much as possible. Wear your masks when you're in public so that we can get over it as soon as possible and get our children safely back to school.
I totally agree with you, and I appreciate you bringing that up, and I think that's an important message. You and I have never met or spoken before, but obviously you're willing to talk about this. What do you make of conversations like that, where there are you might be described by some as alternative facts? Danielle Smith, who I just spoke to, might describe it as exploring other options or other approaches to treating a pandemic. What's your take of conversations like that?
I didn't hear the conversation that you just had with her, so I can't speak to any specific points that she made. All I can say is that scientists are working extremely hard to figure out the safest way out of this pandemic, and that we need to follow the best advice that we can from the CDC as it comes out. And right now that advice is to stay home and wear a mask when you're outside.
Good stuff. I appreciate that. You've been keeping an eye, I would imagine, on this Perseverance rover since its launch in the summer. First of all, what did it mean to you, and what was the experience like for you to see this land successfully on Mars and establish itself in its first few hours?
It was, well, obviously, because of COVID, it's been a really different year. I've been at every Mars landing at JPL since 2004. I witnessed every single one. 2 of them from inside mission operations with the science team, and then the rest of them as a journalist inside with all the rest of the journalists witnessing it and getting the information out to the world. And I have to say that, that landing a spacecraft on another planet, especially Mars, is so difficult that I think that for somebody who's naturally skeptical, it's hard to believe it's actually going to work until it does happen. And that's, it's absolutely terrifying. I find myself hyperventilating in the final moments, waiting for those words from Mission Control about TD nominal, touchdown nominal. And I'm just really excited to have the opportunity to translate what's happening in Mission Control for the rest of the world so that everybody can understand the drama of these landings even better.
And
so
us,
go ahead.
Oh, sorry, Emily. I was just going to say us plebs, we sometimes need it spelled out to us how remarkable of a feat it is. I mean, I think maybe we can even be guilty based on our own, and I don't use the word negatively, but our ignorance or our lack of knowledge of these types of things, of how spectacular the achievement is, just getting it there.
There's no shame in ignorance as long as you're curious and want to, respond to that ignorance with learning. And yeah, there are so many amazing things that had to go right for the spacecraft to land. One of my favorite details of how it landed is something that Curiosity also did when it landed on Mars in 2012. And it's using a technology that hasn't been used since Apollo. And you might say, how has 1970s technology helped out a Mars mission? And the answer is that back in the 1970s, landing on the moon, we had human hands-on controls to guide a spacecraft down to a safe landing on Earth. On Mars, we don't have that. You can't joystick it. It's 11 light minutes away, so that a signal that you send from here takes 11 minutes to get there. By the time it gets there, it's all over. So in order to guide itself to the targeted landing site, this spacecraft, which is a literal flying saucer, it's a dish that was rotating in space, they dropped a ton of weight, well, not a ton, but something like 150 kilograms in order to offset, to kind of tilt as they went through the atmosphere. And then the spacecraft autonomously steered. It banked back and forth 3 times. It was flying in the Martian atmosphere in order to target its landing site. And just imagine being on Mars and seeing this flying saucer doing this back and forth as it's this fiery thing going through the atmosphere. It just would have been the most amazing sight. And that's all before the sky crane thing that you were just showing on the screen there.
Yeah.
So,
well, that's the thing, right, Emily? Like, there's like stage after stage after stage.
Yeah.
I mean, I was even reading their some of the most recent posts, and I find myself, I can't remember the last time I did this, when it came to a science story, which is a real testament, and I hope a huge compliment to the people that are demonstrating just incredible awareness and understanding and intelligence in designing this and carrying it out. But I every morning when I wake up, I'm going to the Perseverance Twitter account to see if there's anything new. And I'm just a guy. I'm not even a scientist, which I think is so cool. And I know that right now I can't remember the name of it, but now they're hoping that the little chopper, the drone, can survive the Martian overnights, the temperatures, so they can test that thing out. I mean, it's going to be test after test after test, and the slightest little thing could throw it all off, couldn't it?
It could, although they do have a lot of intelligence. A lot of the engineering work that they do actually is to catch problems before they become big problems. And so they actually plan ahead for one of every 3 days on Mars not to go well. And when they plan how much time they need to do something on Mars, how many months or years, they just assume that 1 out of every 3 days, things aren't going to go well. So they've got to have enough time. They've got to have enough padding for that. And regardless of what happens on Mars, as long as a spacecraft is still talking to you, you are in good shape. You can fix any problems that arise and move forward. It's when the spacecraft stops talking to you that you're really concerned. I too was checking the feed all weekend long, looking for new information and new images. It's been quite silent this time. It's been very unusual compared to past landings. Curiosity, Spirit and Opportunity, Insight, Phoenix, all the last Mars landers have had tons of information images coming out over the first few days, mostly through this automated raw images pipeline that let images go directly to the internet as soon as they come down on Earth. For reasons I don't quite understand, it hasn't gotten started the way it normally does, but we're assured that after a press briefing that's happening in a little over an hour from now, you're going to be able to start going to the JPL website and seeing brand new images from Mars within hours of their acquisition. They get acquired by the rover, beamed up to an orbiter flying overhead. There's multiple Mars orbiters up there, 4 of them in communication with the rover. And then those get sent down to Earth, they get shunted through the internet, and then they get onto your internet, onto your screen. And you can sometimes check in the middle of the night and see pictures come down from Mars that even the science team hasn't had a chance to look at yet. It's wonderful.
So cool. So, so somebody that knows what's going on, like you, what are some of the, we had a conversation with Dr. Katie Mack on Friday, and she was sort of painting a picture for us. Your eyes lit up like mine did when she joined us. She's just like brilliant. And you and her like you're our bookends on Friday and Monday of covering this story.
Awesome.
But she was talking about how, there's going to be some interest in ascertaining whether or not there, what the water looked like on Mars, or what life on Mars would have looked like, or she described to us why it's important specifically where they landed. Now you're a planetary geologist, is that correct? So what are some
Indeed.
what are some of the specific things that you're really intrigued about?
Well, there's a difference between what I personally am intrigued about and what the mission is intrigued about.
Okay.
I am excited just to see the landscape. As most geologists, I like to put on my hiking boots and walk across Mars. And this promises to be a super pretty landscape to look at. There's all these mesas and hills with layered rocks that it's going to be gorgeous. It's going to be a great road trip. Then once you get close to the rocks and you see their layering, you see what kinds of different kinds of sediments make up the rocks. That tells you how they got made in the first place, what the environment was like when they formed. And so you start being able to read the rocks like the pages of a storybook and start telling the story of this place over history. And telling those kinds of stories there's a whole, it's called historical geology. It's where you read rocks to tell the story of the ancient landscape. And so we're going to find out things about, was this a warm environment? Was it, was the lake covered by ice all the time because it was cold and dry like the present? Or was it actually, little waves lapping up against the Martian sky with puffy clouds overhead? We don't know. And we're going to be able to find that out by looking at the rocks. We're also going to find out how long that lake lasted, whether it was a good place for possibly life to exist, whether there was food in the form of organic materials present, whether there were other interesting things happening in the form of maybe hot springs underneath the crater. This was all happening a super long time ago, 4 billion years ago. We don't have rocks on Earth that are in this good condition to tell us stories about what Earth looked like at that time. So just by looking at these old rocks on Mars, we're actually going to learn about what Earth was like at a similar time in history.
Okay. So this is my next question, which is to broaden the understanding. At a lay person's level, someone may say, okay, you've determined that there was water here 4 billion years ago, or you've determined that maybe it was supporting some form of plant life, but so what? Like, what do we apply that to, or how does that help us better understand it? So as we widen out the view and take a look at it from 10,000 feet, what could we stand to learn or understand? I mean, you've just hinted at it by saying, talking about our own understanding of our own planet. Is that ultimately what it's all about?
Yeah, really the two questions that everything always comes down to are, where did we come from and are we alone? Earth is right now the only place that we know of anywhere that hosts life. We don't know if it was an incredibly unlikely event that has happened rarely anywhere in our universe, or whether it's the kind of thing that happens anywhere that it's possible. The fact that life seems to have arisen on Earth almost as soon as it could survive, more than 3.5 billion years ago. We now have evidence for life going back that far. I forget what the date is that we've now put on the earliest evidence for life, but I think it's somewhere in the 3.7 to 3.8 billion year age. And so since the rocks on Mars are from a similar era with a similar environment, it's a perfect landscape. It's a perfect laboratory for us to ask that question. Given the same conditions at the same time, with the same materials, did life arise on Mars? And if the answer is yes, then that would lead us to conclude that life is common in the universe, very common, because it happened in both places with the same conditions. If we can't find evidence for life, it tends to support the idea that it's a lot harder to get us started and that Earth is special, but it doesn't prove that. But it's part of the process of exploring the solar system to try to understand what unique conditions allowed life to begin on Earth. And then much later in Earth's life history, what allowed unicellular life to suddenly blossom into this incredibly complex and rich flora and fauna of both of multicellular life. which happened a lot later, and so it seems to be much, much harder. But we don't know for sure because, again, only one example so far, just Earth.
Yeah, no kidding. If you're just tuning in, Emily Lakdawalla, our guest, author of The Design and Engineering of Curiosity, How the Mars Rover Performs Its Job. That's your book right behind you, right? I want to let you know, by the way, if I can sort of somewhat divert from I guarantee you're going to sell like 100 copies right now just by holding that up, because people are, it's funny what happens, Emily, in this day and age of Zoom interviews, is that everybody, like, we bring you up full screen and then people just start reading the books on they want to know what you read. One of our viewers right now watching us live on YouTube is curious to know. They say it looks like a lot of nonfiction or maybe a lot of sci-fi on there. What does Emily love to read? Nothing to do with Mars, but what do you love to read?
Oh, just about anything. But yeah, sci-fi and fantasy has always been up there. And, but also just, a lot of classics. There's a lot of good older literature. And now I have 2 daughters who are 11 and 14. I'm reading a lot of young adult literature these days, and there's so much good stuff being published right now with so many more diverse voices than used to be available when I was a kid. And so it's just been delightful to actually start going into a whole new genre that I hadn't really appreciated for such a long time.
Oh, and what a neat relationship or a way to enjoy your relationship with your daughters as well, to dive into reading and explore that type of thing. Have they caught the STEM bug from mom? Are your daughters very interested in science?
I don't know how much credit I get for it. They're certainly interested in science and engineering, but they're interested in other things too. And they're studiously nonplussed about space. They don't want to start me. They don't want to start me on one of my lectures. So they're very careful not to express a whole lot of interest.
Okay, well, we're happy to have you lecture us. So, Emily, when we take a look though at ultimately the landscape of space exploration, I can't pretend to know a ton about it, but I know general themes. The United States, the Soviets, the Chinese have invested, over the decades at different points, more robustly or less, in space exploration, the high-profile Apollo program, the Challenger, the shuttle, et cetera, et cetera. And then there have been times when budgets have been tight or priorities have been different, in particular with American presidents, when space exploration has not been funded as robustly. We now also see private industry entering the mix, and visionaries like Richard Branson and Elon Musk and others attempting to do what they can to push the boundaries of what humans are currently capable of. How would you assess the priority we're placing on space exploration now, and what do you think the next 5 or 10 years might look like?
Well, there's like many different space arenas. There is human space exploration, which right now just goes to the space station, but they're talking about trying to go to the Mars or sometimes to asteroids and other things. There is the commercial space flight that's mostly happening in near Earth space, low Earth orbit, medium Earth orbit, and high, but still all around Earth. There's discussion of space exploitation that's going out and collecting resources from asteroids or the moon or whatever. But my field of interest and expertise is scientific space exploration, which is by and large performed by robots. And there was indeed a very low time around the early 1980s when the Viking missions were coming to an end. The Voyagers had passed by Jupiter and Saturn, and there was a real risk of NASA becoming defunded. And at that point in time, really, Russia was the only other big player in the game, although the European Space Agency and JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency, were both beginning to ramp up their interplanetary efforts. But now is an incredibly rich time for scientific space exploration, because it's not just NASA and ESA and JAXA. The Chinese Space Agency, the Indian Space Agency is there. United Arab Emirates has just placed its first ever deep space mission in orbit at Mars. China has an orbiter, a gigantic orbiter at Mars, and they're just about to land a rover on Mars, or to attempt it anyway. And so there's more than 30 spacecraft operating beyond Earth orbit. It's an incredibly rich time, so much data flowing. And it's just a terrific thing to be involved in, because interplanetary scientific space exploration has always been very international. Even during the Cold War, NASA and Soviet scientists used to trade data with each other. The Soviets had a very successful Venus exploration program, and the Americans had a very successful Mars exploration program. And they would meet and they would exchange scientific data and discuss Mars and Venus and learn about both planets from each other and interpret each other's data. It was terrific then, and it's even more collaborative now.
So very cool. Emily, can I ask you as we thank you for your time here? So all eyes now on the Perseverance, NASA Perseverance, this rover, and of course millions of people following it on social media. And we can't wait to see what we learn, and we'll continue to analyze its findings and its photos. What's next? Like, what are the little kids, like the little boys and girls that are watching this that are like 4 years old and just trying to like we were young when we were watching, Challenger or Apollo or whatever. What are they going to see when they're 25?
Well, there's a lot of cool missions in the pipeline. There is one being developed to send a quadcopter to Titan, one of Saturn's moons. There is a mission being built that is going to go to an all-metal asteroid. And yes, they take full advantage of that whole metal thing in their publication about it. They have there's a mission that's going to go tour a bunch of deep space worlds, a bunch of what are called centaurs. They're tiny refugees from the Kuiper Belt that have been trapped into orbits that are much closer to the sun. There's another mission that's going to go back to Jupiter and explore Europa very up close and set the stage for future landings, possibly on Europa's moon. Even Perseverance is just the first step in a 3-stage mission that will eventually return rock samples to Earth. That is going to be a huge engineering challenge. And so whether you're into science or engineering or doing art for these missions or, communication about them, there's so much scope for involvement in all of this future exploration. And there's all the missions that haven't even been selected yet that get proposed and selected on cycles every year or 5, depending on how big the missions are. It's just such an exciting time to be involved in space exploration.
Oh, to say the least, and to have people like you that can effectively communicate these types of ideas and concepts and findings in a way that not only we can understand, but also get excited about as well. We're really grateful. Emily, thank you so much for making time for us. It's a real pleasure having you on the show.
You're very welcome. Wear your mask.
Yeah, you got it. I promise you I will, Emily. That's
right.
I love that. That's Emily Lakdawalla, who's a planetary geologist. She's obviously an author, a journalist, a speaker. You can check out lakdawalla.com/Emily if you want to learn more about her and follow her on Twitter. That's I don't remember when I started following her, but she's always got great takes and really interesting stuff. And I encourage you to, each and every morning on, right around 8 o'clock Mountain Time, 10 o'clock Eastern, we send out a tweet from my account at Ryan Jesperson letting you know who's coming up on the show, because a lot of you will reach out and say, where can I find more about what that person had to say, or where can I learn more about what they're doing? So we always want to make sure that we point you in the right direction. Our thanks to Emily for that. Very, very cool stuff. These types of conversations made possible by our builders at Real Talk. These are the corporate sponsors that ensure that we're able to keep this journey moving forward and expanding the depth of our coverage. That includes the team at Kubi Energy with offices in Kamloops and Edmonton. They've got Western Canada covered on the commercial and the residential solar front. And as a matter of fact, right now, they want to remind you that when it comes to commercial solar installation, there are some great opportunities right now. New programs, and here's the deal. Kubi Energy does all the paperwork for you, so you don't have to mess around with it yourself. You don't have to get tied down by those obligations. But businesses across Alberta now have this new commercial grant to install solar and complete energy efficiency measures, giving up to 25% off. Kubi Energy can take you through that process. You can check them out online at kubienergy.ca. And a reminder, coming up a little later on in the broadcast, we're going to bring you Positive Reflections, sponsored every Monday by the team at Kubi Energy. We're also grateful for the team at Park Power. Whether it's electricity, natural gas, or internet, the team at Park Power has you covered at parkpower.ca, including an offer to help you save $70 on your first bill, whether it's commercial or residential. $70 up for grabs by using the promo code 2021-Real Talk. When you sign up, $70 off your first bill with 2021-Real Talk. We're also grateful for the team at Eden Landscaping. The weather's starting to turn, my friends, and I know you're going to annoy us. You're watching from Palm Springs or Mesa, Arizona, or you're watching from Miami right now, catching the podcast, and you're going, "What are you talking about? The weather turning? It's been beautiful here. Week after week, it's been beautiful." We're not talking about you guys. We're talking about these hardy souls that have just emerged from the tundra, from the deep freeze, and they're now waiting for the daffodils, and they're waiting for the tulips to start popping up. Yes, I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but I'm enthusiastic. I'm enthusiastic that at some point we'll be able to get back together for things like backyard barbecues with outdoor kitchens and fire pit circles surrounded by planter boxes and retaining walls. And guess what? Eden Landscaping does it all at landscapeedmonton.ca. Check out what they do there for more. It feels like it's been 10 days since I've checked in with my colleague here in the Real Talk studio, technical producer Samuel G. Brooks. It's been a busy morning.
Good morning, buddy.
Yeah.
What do you want to talk about?
Well, we've got a lot to get to. I wanted to do some justice to our exclusive with Danielle Smith. We got a lot of audience response. I didn't spend a lot of time on the comments. I wanted to make sure I was paying keen attention to everything she had to say. But I did get this email, and this is from a viewer, from Janine, that just wrote in. She emailed it to talk@ryanjesperson.com, which means that Sam and I have both seen it. That's how you can make sure an email gets on our radar. Janine says, I tune in when I can. I loathe talk radio, but you bring a well-rounded depth to topics you explore with evidence for what you discuss. It keeps me coming back and feeling better informed than when I started. Ryan, my understanding is that you're a centrist, which is important for uncovering what truth is. And I think your new format is top-notch. Danielle Smith is 100% hard right. It's different from what Danielle told us in the interview. She described herself as center right. She perceives me to be center left. I'm not big on labels. Janine says, despite being a Wild Rose supporter, she says, my biggest beef with her is the peddling of an agenda. Says her dedication to Fraser Institute ideology binds her to what truth actually is. And Janine says, I went so far to file a complaint about her to the CRTC about broadcasting false information. And she says, no, it wasn't about hydroxychloroquine. She says her dangerous messages can have real consequences. We are amidst a reckoning of accountability. People are wanting to know truth. This is not about cancel culture. This is about stations trying to respond to the threat to their industry. Traditional news outlets are under attack. This is not about the individual, Danielle or otherwise, but the broader context of accountability. Journalism is in a dire financial situation. That from Janine, who, by the way, is putting footnotes into her emails. I don't have time to get to these, but this is like one of the most well-written emails I've ever seen in my life. She says YouTube, Twitter, Twitch, other platform hosts are rising to stardom without any fact-checking, without any sort of base on evidence, appealing to the mindset of very narrow audiences, and they're displacing long-established news platforms. There's no accountability for online content, and this worries me, says Janine. Journalists are supposed to hold their work to the highest ethical standards, but few of these online stars are what would qualify as credible journalists. And here's an interesting point that she makes, is that you don't have to be a journalist to be a talk host. Rush Limbaugh just died. People are talking about Rush Limbaugh. I don't know that anybody would describe Rush Limbaugh as a journalist. I mean, maybe you would. I don't know if you'd describe me as a journalist. I don't know if I would describe me as a journalist. As a matter of fact, I just did an interview for a magazine feature that's coming out in the spring. And that was one of the first questions. Are you a journalist? Do you consider yourself a journalist? And I had to think about it. My response, not trying to be non-committal, I said I'm a storyteller. Now, if that's a journalist, there's a journalistic process, but you surrender some objectivity when you take a position as an opinion host, to be sure. Janine says, now listening to your interview today, Danielle's talking again about hydroxychloroquine, defending her right to promote the idea, but she still doesn't understand how the rigors of medicine works. What she's describing about one doctor experiencing success, that's called anecdotal. It's a placebo effect, potentially. She's peddling pseudoscience, and it's frustrating. Goes on to say, actual competent science is not a democratic process. It's not achieved through popular opinion, but through repeatable experiments. As a result of politics in medicine, the U.S. now has a stockpile of these millions of doses of hydroxychloroquine. What an inefficient, wasteful procurement of resources. The Alberta government had tried to petition to circumvent Alberta Health to gain access to a similar stockpile because it had strong public support, garnered from public opinion, like what was broadcasted by Danielle Smith. She's still not apologizing, and that to me is a problem, says Janine. She says, it's hard for me to type and listen at the same time, but I appreciate your time and attention to this. Have a great rest of the show. That from Janine. I appreciate it. There were a lot of people that I think we're sorting through. We tried to cover as much ground as possible. I mean, we could have done an hour on wind and solar alone, As mentioned, we're going to be talking to a couple of individuals, Joshua Rhodes out of the University of Texas, Blake Schaefer out of the University of Calgary. That's coming up on Wednesday at 9 o'clock. What we can learn from Texas's energy woes. That's been a fascinating story. To even understand more, I didn't know before that Texas was completely independent of a grid outside its state borders.
Yeah, I know. And then you also have, this whole thing is a lot to unpack because, first of all, it just seems completely backwards to isolate your power grid just in case of an emergency. Like just to unplug yourself from the rest of the country. And I get that it's a very Texas thing. It's a very libertarian, individual freedoms, control of our own resources argument that they make there for it. But I also just would like to believe that, if for whatever reason the Alberta power grid went offline, thank God we're plugged into Saskatchewan. And I only say that because it's just we need our neighbors to support us. We need to be ready for disasters. And I think the bigger thing with Texas is that their system of deregulation meant that none of their resources were winterized. That's the biggest problem. They've seen this before. There were massive calls to insulate and winterize all of the infrastructure.
They ignored all those calls.
Exactly. And
from
then
10
it
years,
happened again.
10 years ago.
Yeah.
And I think, not to state the obvious, but the whole idea of Texas is, I've been trying to, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes. You want to make sure that you're able to do an interview with a bit of working knowledge. And you look back through Texas history and where the mindset's been with regards to energy sovereignty and all these other types of things. And it goes back, almost 200 years to its origins as a part of Mexico and the fight at the Alamo and that sort of spirit, that Texas spirit. And of course, it has nothing to do with assuming, or this is my opinion, my impression, is that it has nothing to do with assuming that they won't need the external grid, that they won't need help from neighboring states, and has everything to do with the fact that they're shut off so they cannot help, so that they cannot be called upon to help.
Yeah.
Right? It's the understanding that we are not going to help you while lacking the understanding that we may need you to help us.
Well, and this is Texas. You don't mess with Texas. Texas is the great state that can fend for itself. So why would they ever need help? Right? It's a bit of an attitude thing that I think is, again, a very sort of Texas way of looking at the world, and the so-called energy independence that they need is just, I don't know. It baffles me that in a modern world where absolutely everything is interconnected, that just a state would just want to be disconnected, that they would want to, I understand this whole idea of not having to be called upon to help other states, but aren't you missing the point then? Don't you believe in being part of that republic?
Well, to say the least, I think that the folks of, the 30 plus million people in the great state of Texas, I think it's almost 40 million, if I remember correctly. Anyway, it's a lot of people. Tens of millions of people live there. This has been a wake-up call. People without power for days and days and days, people actually dying. It is something that demands attention. And again, something we're going to talk about on Wednesday. Got an interesting, this has been an interesting trend that we've seen for a number of weeks now. Really, it started, I think, with our talk around coal mining in the Rockies. We've also seen it with the Aloha Gate controversy facing Alberta's provincial government. But more and more of you are CCing us, you're including us on your correspondence and your emails to elected officials, which we love. We love that talk@ryanjesperson.com is right there in the CC when you're emailing your mayors, your reeves, your councillors, your MLAs, your MPs, your premier, and the Prime Minister of Canada, or the Leader of Canada's official opposition. We've seen, or not dozens, we've seen thousands of emails, hundreds and hundreds every week, where you tag us into what you're telling your elected officials. And that includes this from Sherry this morning. She has CC'd us on an email that she sent 40 minutes ago. She says, Premier Kenny, just in case you forgot, great way to open a letter. She says, that'll get his attention. Just in case you forgot, says Sherry, laws give us rules of conduct that protect everybody's rights. I'm disgusted with what I've been seeing around my home province of Alberta. When will the law be applied to all members of Grace Life Church, the many, many folks out there gathering together not wearing masks? She says the fact that we're seeing police officers shake hands with demonstrators, we've been told not to do that with these anti-mask protesters, keeping them safe while they protest. The silence of the Alberta government sends a very dangerous message that my life and those that are taking the virus seriously doesn't matter. Which communities are you protecting? Because it sure doesn't look like you're here for the average law-abiding Alberta citizen. That from Sherry, who CC'd us on the email. Now, this is a fascinating pickle that the Premier's in, because you've got people like Sherry that are saying, well, she doesn't necessarily call for specific action except for to say that the law must be applied to all members of Grace Life Church. And you talk to different people and that's going to look like different things. People are saying, hand out tickets to everybody. Other people are saying you should, force some sort of a mandatory quarantine. I mean, I think that's said in jest. I think that's said with hyperbole. But a lot of people would like to see the law enforced. In addition to this pastor, James Coates, who's currently, unless things have changed in the last couple hours, is in the Edmonton remand. And then on the flip side, you've got people like Danielle Smith who joined us and talked about this, and many other people. These pastors claim that they're getting support from congregations across the province and across the country. They say they're getting thousands of messages from other churches that are encouraging them. These people are pressuring the Premier to open up the churches. Danielle Smith says on Friday to Jason Kenney, "Did you ever think you would preside over a government that is jailing pastors?" And that's a supercharged narrative there. You try to walk a mile in Premier Jason Kenney's shoes, especially observing his base and who he has to walk the line for, and he's in a tough spot. You might call it a no-win position.
I think we all have to remember that this pastor wanted to be jailed. Okay? Like, it's this pastor was given warnings, tickets, fines, health officers that have tried to work with them kindly. He wanted to be behind bars. He wants to be a martyr. And that's why I find this situation so frustrating, because if you were to do the thing where you roll up and just hand out tickets left, right, and center, you know that there's going to be a giant fundraising action to probably pay all the tickets and to fight the court fees and to make this a bigger thing than it is. Like, the amount of oxygen that is this community is lapping up because they know they have this support, and they know that there are people that are going to use phrases like jailed pastors that will rally them up. I mean, you're spot on when you say this is a fundraising initiative.
Yeah. Grant from Wainwright sends us a message and says, the Grace Life pastor is no martyr. He's a carnival barker trying to feign crucifixion on a hill too small. Jason Kenney is Pontius Pilate, punchless Pilate, maybe. That from Grant from Wainwright. That's a pretty good email.
I enjoy some biblical puns.
I'm checking my email inbox live, and I have an email here from Sherry. The subject line is seriously, shame on you. So I want to get to this. She says, I've listened to your show every day. I've mostly been on board with your narrative. I don't know what my narrative is. She says, I have to say, during your interview with Danielle Smith, when you said all the people rallying at the legislature were fans of hers, not exactly what I said, but I'll read your email. She says, that was so rude. And in my opinion, Ryan, you are part of the problem with society nowadays. This type of belief and comment is what causes division. Sherry says, I'm smack dab in the middle of the political spectrum. I enjoy listening to you and Danielle equally. But that comment you made was a low blow. Maybe you need to check yourself and what extreme side that comment represented when you're busy pointing the finger at what you call the extreme right. That from Sherry. First of all, appreciate you listening to the show. Appreciate you watching the show. And thanks for taking the time to email in. As we told you, we're more inclined to pay attention to and read the emails and the messages that are somewhat critical of what we're doing, as opposed to all the praise. Because in my opinion, number one, it allows us to make the show better. Number two, it allows me to follow up on some things like I'm about to do here. And number three, I mean, really, it allows us to get a better understanding as well of how people are feeling about what they're hearing and what they're seeing here on the show. Plus, it proves that not everybody agrees, right? Which is a good thing. What I said to Danielle was that a lot of the people that gathered, that would gather to rally like this would be fans of hers. And I would stand by the statement. Danielle clearly didn't like the statement. She said not preposterous, but she said something like that. Like she didn't like the statement. And here's what I'm basing that on. And I said to her, it's not meant to be a swipe at you. It's an observation. I have insight into Danielle's audience that would be bested only by Danielle's insight into her former audience. And that is because for a number of years, Danielle and I hosted in the same time slot in Edmonton and Calgary for Chorus Radio. And when I was gone, she filled in on a province-wide simulcast broadcasting into Edmonton. And when she was gone, I would broadcast simulcast province-wide into Calgary. And we would have both of our text lines open. And these text lines are nasty places. And I've told you about these text lines before. And I've talked to you about one of the biggest improvements in my own personal mental health has been leaving that text line behind. So I would see firsthand, I would hear from audience members, and you're going to sit there and say, these views that you were hearing are not representative of the entire audience. Obviously not. But loud, consistent voices that would pile on me for things like, if you would talk about, if you even dared to mention exploration of expanding Alberta's so-called renewable energy grid, or if you even dared to talk about things like a carbon tax, or if you dared to talk about things like a sales tax, or if you dared to, these types of things, Danielle's audience, typically and generally speaking, using sweeping generalizations, was far more sort of right-wing conservative than the typical audience member of mine. And so when I followed back and circled back and said to Danielle in the interview, if you were to go to the Alberta legislature yesterday wearing like 6 N95 masks and a 3-meter diameter hula hoop around your waist to make sure that nobody could get close to you, and if you were to ask them, hey, if Jesperson's on the radio or if Danielle Smith's on the radio, which show are you going to listen to? I think it's pretty obvious that more people would listen to her. Now, am I saying that Danielle Smith endorses the views of Proud Boys or QAnon or anything like that? Obviously not. But I do think that she had more of I don't think that this is news to anybody, more of a right-wing, if you want to call it, you might want to call it like different, like libertarian or right-wing or, sort of small government conservative type following, very strong following in rural communities, obviously the former leader of the Wild Rose Party. And she does have a strong following, and I'm curious to see what happens at locals.com. With regards to me being part of the problem, for Sherry to say I need to check myself and what extreme side my comment represented, busy pointing the finger at what I call the extreme right. If not the extreme right, how would you describe the folks that marched through Edmonton under police protection yesterday and gathered at the Alberta legislature carrying tiki torches, some of them wearing the red MAGA ball caps, signs with big Qs on them, QAnon, signs talking about globalists, which if you want to do your own Googling, you can find how globalism and globalist is just a big anti-Semitic dog whistle. I encourage you to read up on it. These signs were everywhere. Like pimples on the face of a teenage boy. These signs were across that demonstration yesterday. And if you believe that the demonstration was only to do with wearing masks, then I got news for you. Not at all. So I would describe that as an extreme right demonstration yesterday, and I would stand by it. With regards to being part of the problem, Sherry, you've acknowledged that, you've tuned into the show. You say since it began, you say you've listened to it every single day. If that's the case, number one, I'm grateful. Number two, you'll know that we've been talking to a whole bunch of people with a whole bunch of different perspectives. The other day, a friend of mine said to me, you got to work on getting more conservatives on your show. And off the top of my head, I rattled off about 10 of them. And I said, they've been there. And he goes, oh. And then I talked to somebody else that says, what's with all the conservatives you're having on your show, right? You're going to get more people on the left on your show. Maybe it says something about the landscape of talk radio where people aren't used to tuning into a show. People aren't used to being able to subscribe to a podcast or to a live broadcast that is going to feature people from across the spectrum, that on the same day might have somebody that, like Lieutenant Colonel David Redmond, that thinks that basically we should just completely reopen society, right? We should lock down long-term care centers and quarantine people with potential comorbidities and essentially blow open society, reopen it again completely. And then hours later on the show, or a couple of days later on the show, have an Antifa activist from Portland talking about defunding the police, and it's on the same show. So, people will write in and say, I'm not going to tune into this interview. No, thanks. This one I'm going to miss. That's totally fine. That's great. That's probably a healthy relationship with the show, right? I have friends that own restaurants. It doesn't mean I love every dish they serve, and it doesn't mean that I have dinner there every single night. But we appreciate your continued participation in the show. We appreciate the comments that you put in front of us. Something like Sherry's comment there will give me food for thought. And it's something that I'll walk with today and think, was it a fair interview with Danielle? Was that a fair comment? I mean, I think it was. Danielle didn't like it. That's fine. You know, if she was conducting and interviewing me, she might say a few things that I might not like. That's a sign of a good interview. You know, someone being interviewed should be uncomfortable from time to time. They should get a little defensive from time to time. The questions should have meaning. They should make me uncomfortable as a host and make you uncomfortable as a viewer. That's how I feel about it. The team at Alta Moving and Storage wants you to know that they recognize that moving is enough to make most people shudder. It's one of the most stressful things that we do, and that's why they're committed to taking as much stress out of the process as they can, including these pod-style containers that they have. They're locally owned and operated, so it's as simple as a phone call. You give them a shout, you tell them what they need, and then they work with you to come up with the perfect moving solution. They drop off these pod-style containers, you fill them up, or they can provide labor if you need it. They move it to your new destination, and Bob's your uncle. You can check him out at altastorage.ca. That's if Uncle Bob's not helping with the move, of course. 780-993-ALTA is the number you can get him at. And don't forget, oh yeah, they have short and long-term storage too. We're also grateful to be partnering with the team at Westworld Computers. They've got a complete lineup of the new stuff, of course, but also the gently pre-owned, reloaded, re-warrantied Apple products everybody loves to have. Whether it's a gently used watch, one of the iPhones that's relatively new but maybe not brand new, or an iMac, or maybe a MacBook Pro you want to get, but the new ones are just a little out of your price range. Westworld and Daryl and his team have you covered. You can check them out. They've been proudly family-owned for more than 40 years. Sam, every Monday, it's our pleasure to present, thanks to our friends at Kubi Energy, a little something we call Positive Reflections. All right, we've got a bit of a theme here, and it developed somewhat accidentally, but on today's Positive Reflections, we're going to show off the Aurora Borealis, because real talkers en masse are posting remarkable captures, time-lapse captures like this one, these ones from Images by Stan. I encourage you to follow Stan online at Images by Stan. Absolutely stunning captures of the Northern Lights. And how about this one? This is from Sumistar on Instagram. You absolutely must give them a follow. Sam, your thoughts on this?
I'm jealous that I haven't been able to get out and shoot some Aurora. This just looks absolutely spectacular.
Because you're a photographer.
I am, and I also host a morning show, and these captures come at like 3 a.m.
Okay.
Or produce a morning show, I should say.
What are you saying? You want to start showing up a little bit later? Is that what you're saying? Sam's trying to get us to ease up on the job requirements. You know what? I would love to work in some of your Northern Lights imagery into the show imagery. Wouldn't that be cool? Sumistar, thanks for that. And then this is a great story as well. Do you remember? You remember the two science dogs? You know, I mean, yeah, they've got a human that they live with and everything, but you remember Bunsen the Burner? Remember Bunsen the Bernese Mountain Dog and his buddy Beaker? Well, I'm thrilled to tell you that they participated in a dog rescue over the weekend. Check this out. Now, this is actually not, we're not talking like an adoption dog rescue. We're talking a literal rescue. Bunsen was out with his human buddy, and they came across another dog. It looks to me like a fellow Bernese that was in distress. It had gone missing. They didn't know if it was a stray. It appeared to be clearly injured. It was in a creek bank. And after some good human work, Bunsen then took over, the four-legged furry rescuer, and ensured that this dog got back to a place where it could receive medical care. Now, it turns out that the dog belongs to a family that was horrified it had gone missing. And they were especially nervous because epilepsy is an issue. We're thrilled to tell you that thanks to Bunsen's great detective work, finding that dog in the creek bed, hiding. And you know what that means when dogs have gone to hide? They were able to get it back somewhere safe, and that dog will live to see another day. So our shout out to our favorite Bernese Mountain Dog, Bunsen, his special friend Beaker, and their human family as well for making that happen. Now, I know what's going to happen right now. You're going to send us an email, and you're going to say, hey, listen, we catch the show on the podcast, and all these positive reflection stories are videos and photos, and we can't see them. Well, if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, we post Positive Reflections as a separate file so you can check it out, you can see what we're talking about, and hey, maybe be inspired to send us your own stories too. What makes you happy? What do you think would get Real Talkers another week started off on the right foot? Our thanks to Kubi Energy for the partnership. You can submit your positive reflections to talk@ryanjesperson.com. Tomorrow, we're going to talk to Amarjeet Sohi, former federal minister, and Paula Simons, a Canadian senator. The two of them have different ideas on how society should respond to demonstrations of racism. But they're coming at it in the same spirit, and we're going to talk it out starting at 8:30 a.m. Mountain Time. Between now and then, make it a great day, and we'll talk to you soon.